Hey there, night crew. Tonight we're cracking open one of history's best-kept secrets, the ancient Greek symposium. You probably think it was some highbrow philosophical salon where Socrates and his buddies sat around discussing the meaning of life over herbal tea. Wrong. Dead wrong. This was organized drinking disguised as intellectual activity, and somehow it gave birth to Western philosophy. Yeah, you heard that right. Before we dive in, smash that like button if you're ready for this ride and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? What's your local time right now? I love seeing who's rolling with me on these deep dives into history's wildest contradictions. Now kill those lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about how ancient Greece turned getting drunk into a cultural institution that somehow changed civilization forever. This is going to get weird. Let's go. So here's the thing about ancient Greek symposia that nobody really tells you in school. When your history teacher mentioned that Plato and Socrates and all those philosophical heavy hitters spent their evenings at these elegant gatherings discussing the nature of reality and the good life, they conveniently left out the part where everyone was getting absolutely hammered. We're talking about an institution that somehow managed to be simultaneously a drinking party and the birthplace of Western philosophy. Which, when you think about it, is either the most Greek thing ever or the most ridiculous cultural contradiction in human history. Probably both. The symposium wasn't just some casual get-together where a few guys decided to crack open a bottle and see where the conversation went. This was a meticulously orchestrated social ritual that had more rules than a modern corporate retreat, except instead of trust falls and team-building exercises, the main activity was consuming enough wine to make everyone forget those rules by the end of the night. The Greeks had essentially invented a system where getting drunk was not just acceptable, but practically mandatory, and they'd wrapped it up in enough cultural prestige and intellectual pretension that nobody could call them out for what it really was. Genius, really. Not exactly the kind of innovation that gets you a Nobel Prize in the modern era, but certainly one that shaped Western civilization in ways we're still dealing with today. Think about it this way. Imagine if someone today proposed that the best way to advance human knowledge was to gather the smartest people in society, get them all drunk in a room with no escape route, and just see what happened. You'd probably get some raised eyebrows. Questions would be asked. HR would definitely be involved. But the ancient Greeks pulled this off for centuries, and somehow we ended up with philosophical dialogues that are still taught in universities worldwide. The symposium existed in this bizarre space between chaos and order, between getting sloshed and achieving enlightenment, and the Greeks not only made it work but turned it into one of their most important cultural institutions. The word symposium itself is almost criminally misleading if you're coming at it from a modern perspective. Today, when we hear symposium, we think of stuffy academic conferences where people read papers in monotone voices while everyone else fights to stay awake and wonders if the coffee is worth the walk to the back of the room. The ancient Greek version was different. The word literally translates to drinking together, which is refreshingly honest compared to the euphemisms we use today. They weren't calling it a social networking event or a collaborative intellectual exchange. It was drinking together, full stop. Everything else that happened was just bonus content. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't random drinking. The Greeks didn't just show up, grab whatever was available and start chugging. They had rules. So many rules. Rules about how the wine should be mixed, who could speak when, what topics were appropriate at which stage of the evening, how one should recline on the couches, what to do if someone started getting too emotional or aggressive. It was like they'd taken the concept of getting drunk and subjected it to the same kind of systematic analysis that they applied to mathematics and logic. Only the Greeks would look at intoxication and think, you know what this needs? Structure. The whole thing operated on this fundamental paradox that the Greeks seemed uniquely capable of embracing. They wanted to break down social barriers and create a space where men could speak freely without the usual constraints of Athenian society. But they also wanted to maintain enough control that the evening didn't devolve into complete chaos. So they invented this elaborate system of rules and rituals that would gradually be dissolved by the very activity the rules were designed to govern. It's like building a sandcastle knowing the tide is coming in, except the Greeks kept building the same sandcastle every time and acting surprised when it got washed away. The predictability was the point. Wine was the key to the whole operation, obviously. But Greek wine wasn't like what you'd pick up at your local store today. This stuff was thick, sweet, and so alcoholic that drinking it straight was considered barbaric. The Greeks were very proud of this distinction. They'd point to the Scythians and other northern peoples who apparently drank their wine unmixed and say, "See? That's what uncivilized people do." The implication being that adding water to your wine was a sign of sophistication and self-control, which is a bit like claiming you're practicing moderation because you add ice to your whiskey before drinking the whole bottle, but the Greeks made it work somehow. The mixing of wine and water happened in a crater, which was basically a large bowl that sat in the middle of the room like some kind of alcoholic centerpiece. The ratio of wine to water was a matter of serious debate, and apparently said a lot about the philosophy of whoever was hosting the evening. Too much water, and you were being a killjoy who didn't understand the point of the gathering. Not enough water, and you were trying to turn the symposium into some kind of frat party, which defeated the purpose of having all those rules in the first place. The sweet spot was somewhere in the middle, though exactly where that middle was seems to have been a matter of personal interpretation, and probably changed as the evening progressed, and everyone's judgment got progressively worse. What's fascinating is that the quality of the wine actually mattered to these guys. A lot. This wasn't a case of anything will do as long as it gets the job done. The source of the wine, its age, the vintage, the vineyard it came from, all of this was relevant information that would be discussed and analysed. Serving cheap wine at a symposium was apparently a social disaster, roughly equivalent to showing up to a wedding in sweatpants. It broadcast to everyone present that either you were poor, you were cheap, or you fundamentally didn't understand how this whole thing was supposed to work. None of these were good looks in ancient Athens. But let's back up a bit, because before anyone was drinking anything, there was the whole matter of actually getting invited to a symposium in the first place. This is where the social engineering really started. You couldn't just show up. This wasn't an open invitation situation. Getting asked to attend was like being admitted to an exclusive club, except the membership criteria were never quite spelled out, and could change depending on who was doing the inviting and what kind of evening they were trying to orchestrate. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of diplomatic language. It would talk about conversation and friendship and spending the evening in good company, but everyone involved understood that these were code words. The actual message was, "We're getting drunk, want to join?" But you couldn't just say that outright because that would make the whole thing sound less sophisticated than it was supposed to be. The Greeks had mastered the art of making drinking sound intellectual, and it started with how they phrased the invitation. Modern wedding invitations could learn something from this level of euphemistic creativity, honestly. Choosing who to invite was an art form in itself. The host had to think carefully about the mix of people. You wanted some folks who agreed with each other because that created a comfortable baseline and ensured the evening wouldn't turn into a complete disaster. But you also needed people who would disagree, who would challenge each other, who might get a little heated in their debates because that's where the interesting stuff happened. Too much harmony, and the evening would be boring. Too much conflict, and it would turn ugly. The ideal symposium walked this tightrope between friendly agreement and intellectual combat, which is harder to calibrate than it sounds, especially when everyone's judgment is going to be increasingly impaired as the night goes on. There was also a clear class element to all of this. Symposia were not democratic institutions, despite all the Greek rhetoric about equality and citizenship. These were gatherings of the elite, by the elite, for the elite. You needed to be educated enough to hold your own in philosophical discussions, wealthy enough that you had the leisure time to spend entire evenings drinking and talking, and connected enough that someone actually wanted to invite you. The average Athenian farmer or craftsman wasn't getting invited to these things. They were working, which is what most people did most of the time in the ancient world, because economies based on agriculture and manual labour don't really allow for extensive midweek drinking sessions. The educational requirement was particularly important. You couldn't just show up knowing nothing and expect to participate. These men were expected to be able to quote Homer from memory, to reference the pre-Socratic philosophers, to understand the cultural touchstones that everyone else would be referencing throughout the evening. This wasn't casual conversation. It was performance, and you needed to know your lines. Walking into a symposium unprepared would be like showing up to a modern academic conference without having read any of the papers, except everyone would know immediately, and you'd be exposed in front of a room full of people who would remember your failure for years. Not ideal. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Refusing an invitation was genuinely risky. You couldn't just say thanks, but I'm busy that evening without consequences. In Athenian society, where reputation and social connections were everything, Turning down an invitation could be interpreted as either an insult to the host or a sign that you were becoming socially isolated. Neither was good. An insult could damage important relationships and maybe even impact your standing in the city. Being seen as isolated suggested that maybe other people were avoiding you, which raised questions about what you'd done to deserve that. So you showed up, even if you really didn't want to, because not showing up could cost you more than one uncomfortable evening. The structure of the invitation also created a kind of social contract. By accepting, you were agreeing to participate according to the rules, even though those rules were rarely explicitly stated. You were promising to drink when drinking was called for, to speak when it was your turn, to listen when it wasn't, to engage with the topics under discussion even if you found them boring or stupid, and generally to be a good sport about the whole thing. You were also implicitly agreeing not to repeat certain things that might be said later in the evening when everyone was drunk and their guard was down. Though whether people actually honoured that last bit is questionable, because humans are humans regardless of the century. The actual language of invitations varied, but they tended to follow certain patterns. They'd emphasise the positive aspects, the good company, the excellent wine that would be served, the interesting topics that might be discussed, while carefully avoiding any mention of the fact that by the end of the evening, everyone would be stumbling around and possibly saying things they'd regret in the morning. It was all very civilised on paper. The reality would be somewhat different, but that's true of most things that sound good in invitation form. Nobody RSVPs to chaos, but chaos is often what you get when you put wine in front of a group of competitive men who think they're smarter than everyone else in the room. What makes this whole invitation system particularly interesting is that it created a kind of intellectual economy. Your value as a potential guest was determined by what you could bring to the conversation. If you were known as a good speaker, someone who could argue persuasively and entertainingly, your social stock went up. If you were wealthy, you might host your own symposia, and therefore become someone worth staying on good terms with. If you had interesting information or connections, that gave you currency. But if you were boring, or stupid, or couldn't hold your wine, or kept saying inappropriate things at the wrong moments, your invitations would dry up. The symposium circuit was self-regulating in that way. Social Darwinism with wine. The timing of symposia is worth noting too. These weren't lunch events. They happened in the evening after the main meal of the day. This was partly practical. People had work to do during daylight hours, even wealthy Athenians, but it was also strategic. Evening created a natural boundary around the event. There was a beginning and theoretically an end, though that end might come very late depending on how things went. The darkness outside also added to the sense of the symposium as a separate space, cut off from the normal world. Inside the andron, with the lamps lit and the wine flowing, you were in a different reality with different rules. Outside, Athens continued with its regular business, but that wasn't your concern for the duration of the evening. The frequency of symposia varied depending on who you were and who you knew. Some men might attend several per week during busy social seasons, others might go less often. There doesn't seem to have been a strict schedule or pattern. They happened when someone decided to host one and sent out invitations. This meant you couldn't really plan your week around them. You just had to be ready when the invitation came and hope you didn't have something else important happening that night. Though given the social importance of symposia, it's hard to imagine what could have been more important. Maybe a funeral, maybe. One aspect that's easy to overlook is that these gatherings required significant resources. Someone had to pay for the wine, which wasn't cheap. Someone had to prepare the food that would be served before the drinking started. Someone needed to provide the space, maintain it, keep it clean, provide enough couches for everyone, ensure there was adequate lighting. Slaves had to be available to serve the wine, to clean up messes, to handle various tasks throughout the evening. None of this was free or easy. Hosting a symposium was a way to display wealth and generosity, which is why doing it well mattered. Screwing it up by serving bad wine or not having enough food or letting the space get too dirty was embarrassing, not just personally but socially. You were failing at something that was supposed to be one of your core competencies as a wealthy Athenian man. The social pressure to reciprocate was also significant. If someone invited you to their symposium, there was an expectation that you'd eventually host one yourself and invite them back. This created a kind of circuit where the same groups of men would rotate through each other's houses, taking turns at hosting. It was networking, ancient style, except the networking happened while everyone was progressively getting more drunk. Whether this made the networking more or less effective is debatable. On one hand, alcohol can make people more open and honest. On the other hand, it also makes them more likely to say stupid things they'll regret. The Greeks seemed to think the trade-off was worth it, or at least they kept doing it. What's particularly striking about the symposium as an institution is how it formalized something that humans have always done anyway. People have been gathering to drink together since someone figured out fermentation, but the Greeks took this universal human behavior and turned it into something that served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was entertainment, sure, but it was also education, social bonding, political networking, philosophical inquiry, artistic performance, and probably a few other things depending on the specific evening and who was present. They'd found a way to make drinking productive, which is either very impressive or very Greek or both. The philosophical aspect is what gets the most attention historically, and for good reason. Some of the most important texts in Western philosophy are set at symposia. Plato's Symposium is literally named after the institution, and features a group of men at a drinking party discussing the nature of love. The fact that they're drunk is relevant to how the dialogue unfolds and what gets said. Xenophon wrote his own symposium, offering a different take on similar themes. These weren't dry academic exercises happening in sterile classroom environments. They were wine-fueled conversations where the alcohol was part of the point, not incidental to it. But here's what's interesting. The philosophical dialogues that survived were written down by people who were probably either sober when they wrote them, or at least sobered up significantly before putting stylus to papyrus. So what we have is a sanitized, organized version of conversations that in reality were probably messier, more chaotic and less coherent than what appears on the page. Plato wasn't transcribing in real time. He was reconstructing from memory, probably combining multiple evenings into one, definitely editing out the parts where someone spilled wine all over themselves, or fell off a couch or started crying about their ex-girlfriend. The symposium in literature is the idealized version. The actual symposium was probably more like a really long episode of a reality show, except with more ancient Greek and fewer camera crews. This gap between the ideal and the real is crucial to understanding why the symposium worked as well as it did. The Greeks knew they were getting drunk. They weren't pretending otherwise. But they created enough structure and ritual around the drinking that it felt like something more elevated than just a bunch of guys getting hammered. The rules gave it legitimacy. The philosophical discussions gave it purpose. The careful selection of guests gave it exclusivity. All of these elements combined to transform what could have been just another drinking session into something that felt culturally significant. Whether it actually was significant or whether everyone involved was just really good at convincing themselves it was significant is honestly hard to say from this distance. Probably a bit of both. The competitive element can't be ignored either. Greek men were competitive about everything: athletics, warfare, politics, poetry, you name it. The symposium gave them another arena for competition. Who could drink the most while still speaking coherently? Who could make the best argument? Who could deliver the most devastating comeback? Who could demonstrate the most extensive knowledge of Homer or the poets? These weren't just friendly chats. They were contests, and like all Greek contests, there were winners and losers, even if the prizes were just reputation and bragging rights. This competitive aspect actually served a useful social function. It channeled male aggression into verbal rather than physical combat. Instead of fighting each other with swords, they fought with words and ideas. Instead of competing in the gymnasium, they competed in wit and eloquence. The symposium was, in a weird way, a pressure release valve for a society that was otherwise pretty violent and didn't have a lot of peaceful outlets for male competition. Better to have them trying to out-argue each other while drunk than trying to kill each other while sober. The role of wine in all of this goes beyond just lowering inhibitions, though that was certainly part of it. Wine was a social lubricant, sure, but it was also a kind of truth serum in the Greek imagination. There was a concept, in vino veritas, in wine, truth. The idea was that alcohol stripped away the social masks people wore and revealed their true nature. What you said when drunk was supposedly what you really thought and felt, unfiltered by the usual social constraints. Whether this is actually true is questionable. Drunk people say all kinds of things they don't mean, but the Greeks believed it, and that belief shaped how symposia functioned. If wine revealed truth, then getting drunk together was a way of getting to know people's real selves, not just the public personas they projected. This created an interesting dynamic. On one hand, there was pressure to be authentic and honest during symposia because that was supposedly the whole point. On the other hand, anything you said while drunk could potentially be used against you later, so there was also pressure to maintain some level of self-control even while pretending not to. The symposium was simultaneously a space of radical honesty and calculated performance. Men were supposed to let their guards down while also being very aware that they were being watched and judged. It's psychologically complicated in ways that the Greeks probably didn't fully work out but definitely experienced. The physical setting of these events also matters more than you might think. The andron, the men's room where symposia happened, wasn't just any room in the house. It was specifically designed for this purpose. The couches were arranged around the perimeter, creating a circle where everyone could see everyone else. There was no hiding in the back, no sneaking out unnoticed. Once you were in, you were committed to being present and visible for the duration. The layout forced participation and made privacy impossible, which was exactly the point. The symposium was a collective experience. You couldn't just attend and zone out. Well, you could, but everyone would notice, which defeated the purpose of showing up in the first place. The archaeological evidence for androns is actually pretty interesting. We can see how these rooms were built, how they were decorated, roughly how many people they could accommodate. Most seem to have held between 7 and 15 guests, which is a manageable size for conversation, but large enough to create interesting social dynamics. Too few people, and the symposium would feel empty and awkward. Too many, and you'd lose the intimacy that made the whole thing work. The Greeks apparently figured out the sweet spot through trial and error, and then just kept building rooms that would hold that many couches. One thing that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention is that all of this, the invitations, the wine mixing, the couches, the conversations, was gendered male to an almost absurd degree. Respectable women weren't present at symposia. Wives, daughters, mothers, sisters, none of them were invited. This wasn't an oversight. It was intentional and structural. The symposium was a male space, defined in part by the absence of the women who otherwise dominated Greek men's domestic lives. Why this was necessary is something the Greeks themselves weren't entirely clear about, but the exclusion was consistent and deliberate. The absence of respectable women meant that the men at symposia could behave in ways they couldn't when those women were around. They could be cruder, more aggressive, more openly emotional. They could discuss topics that would have been inappropriate in mixed company. They could drink without having to worry about setting a bad example, or being judged by the women in their families. The symposium was essentially a licensed space for behaviour that was otherwise constrained. It's similar to how modern guys' nights function, except with more philosophy and better wine. But here's the thing, while respectable women were excluded, other women were very much present. Musicians, dancers and hetairai, educated courtesans, were regular features of symposia. These women performed, entertained, and participated in the evening's activities in ways that the men's wives and daughters never could. Their presence was considered appropriate precisely because they weren't respectable in the conventional sense. They existed outside the normal social categories, which meant they could be in spaces where regular women couldn't. It's a weird double standard that made perfect sense to the Greeks, and probably seems bizarre to us, because it was. These women had a unique position. They were present but not really participants in the same way the men were. They performed when asked, stayed quiet when not needed, and generally served as decoration and entertainment rather than equals. But they were also observers. They saw everything that happened, heard everything that was said, and remembered it all while remaining sober enough to do their jobs. In a room full of drunk men competing to prove their intelligence and wit, the women who were actually sober and watching quietly were probably getting the clearest view of what was really happening. Whether anyone recognized the irony of this situation is unclear. The philosophical content of symposia, when it happened, often focused on topics that men of the time found fascinating, but that modern readers might find either obvious or weird. Love was a big one, the nature of virtue, what made a life good, whether the gods existed and if so what they were like. These questions don't have easy answers, which made them perfect for extended drunken debates where you could argue for hours without reaching any conclusions. The lack of resolution was probably fine. The point wasn't to solve philosophy. It was to demonstrate that you could engage with it intelligently, or at least well enough to impress the other guys in the room. Rhetoric was also important. How you argued mattered as much as what you argued. Greek education placed huge emphasis on speaking well, and the symposium was a place to show off those skills. You could present the most ridiculous position imaginable, but if you defended it cleverly and with good humour, that was considered impressive. The content was almost secondary to the performance. This might sound frivolous, but it actually had practical applications. In Athenian democracy, where important decisions were made through public debate and voting, being able to speak persuasively was a survival skill. The symposium was practice for the real thing, except with wine. Music and poetry were other common features. Someone might be called on to sing or recite poetry, often improvised or adapted to fit the moment. This wasn't optional. If you were at a symposium and someone said it was your turn to perform, you performed. Refusing would be embarrassing. Doing it badly would also be embarrassing, but at least you tried. The Greeks valued this kind of spontaneous artistic expression, probably because it required both skill and confidence, both of which were worth demonstrating to your peers. Plus, drunk men tend to be more forgiving audiences than sober ones, which helped. Games sometimes happened too. Kottabos was popular. You'd flick wine dregs from your cup at a target while calling out the name of someone you liked. It was basically an excuse to show off your dexterity while publicly declaring your crushes. There were also word games, riddles, challenges to see who could drink in certain prescribed ways. The Greeks turned everything into competition, even the act of getting drunk. Why drink normally when you could make it into a contest with rules and winners? This is very on brand for them. As the evening progressed and everyone got progressively more intoxicated, the character of the symposium would shift. Early conversations might be relatively controlled and intellectual. Later ones would get louder, more emotional, less coherent. Arguments that started as friendly debates could turn heated. People would get philosophical about their feelings. Someone would probably cry at some point, because alcohol makes people emotional, and Greek men apparently weren't any different from modern ones in this regard. The careful structure that had defined the early evening would gradually dissolve, which was inevitable and probably expected. The symposium was designed to have an arc, moving from order to chaos as the wine did its work. The next morning would bring a different kind of reckoning. Physical hangovers were just the start. There was also the social hangover, the process of remembering or learning what you'd said and done, figuring out what others remembered and dealing with any consequences. Did you insult someone important? Make a fool of yourself? Say something that could be used against you later? These questions wouldn't have clear answers immediately, because everyone was dealing with their own fragmented memories and trying to piece together what had actually happened. It was like a collective detective story, except everyone was both investigator and suspect. The Greeks didn't romanticize hangovers the way some modern cultures do. They knew they were the price you paid for the freedom and insight that wine supposedly provided. Whether that trade-off was worth it probably depended on how good the wine was, how interesting the conversation had been, and how badly you'd embarrassed yourself. Some mornings you'd wake up thinking, that was totally worth it. Other mornings you'd wake up thinking, I'm never doing that again, while knowing full well you absolutely would do it again the next time you got invited. What makes the symposium such a fascinating institution is that it shouldn't have worked as well as it did. Taking a bunch of competitive, educated men, getting them drunk, putting them in a room where they have to perform for each other, and expecting anything productive to come out of it seems optimistic at best. And yet somehow this system produced or facilitated some of the foundational texts of Western philosophy. Either the Greeks stumbled onto something genuinely valuable in this weird combination of structure and chaos, or they were really good at retroactively claiming that their drinking parties had been important all along. History suggests it's probably some of both. The symposium was, in many ways, perfectly designed for its culture. It gave Greek men a space to be vulnerable and competitive simultaneously. It allowed for both intellectual exchange and emotional expression. It provided structure while promising chaos. It was exclusive enough to feel special, but common enough that most men in the elite classes would attend one regularly. It served multiple social functions while pretending to be just about wine and conversation. The genius of it was that it was all of these things at once, and that complexity is part of what made it work. A simpler institution wouldn't have had the same staying power or cultural impact. Looking back from the modern era, it's tempting to either romanticize the symposium as some kind of ideal intellectual community, or to dismiss it as just a drinking club for privileged men. The reality is more complicated and more interesting than either of those extremes. The symposium was definitely a drinking club for privileged men. That's not in dispute. but it was also genuinely a space where important ideas were discussed, refined, and sometimes even originated. Both things can be true simultaneously. The Greeks had found a way to make getting drunk productive, and while we might question some of the details of how they did it, the basic insight that informal social spaces can generate real intellectual value remains valid. Every graduate student who's ever had a breakthrough insight during a conversation at a bar is unknowingly participating in the legacy of the ancient Greek symposium. The setting has changed. The wine is different. But the basic idea, that sometimes the best conversations happen when you're relaxed, slightly drunk, and talking with people who challenge your thinking, that part the Greeks got right, and it's survived for 2,500 years. Not bad for what started as an elaborate excuse to drink wine with your friends. The Greeks understood something that modern party planners have mostly forgotten. The space where you drink matters almost as much as what you're drinking. The andron, the room specifically designed for symposia, wasn't just some random chamber in the house where they happened to put couches. This was a purpose-built environment engineered to facilitate a very specific kind of social interaction, which was getting a group of competitive men drunk while keeping them civilized enough that nobody actually got killed. Not exactly a problem that comes up in modern interior design magazines, but the Greeks apparently thought about it seriously enough to develop architectural solutions. The most obvious feature of the andron was the couches, which were arranged around the perimeter of the room in a rough circle or square depending on the room's shape. Everyone faced inward, toward the centre where the crater sat like some kind of alcoholic altar. This wasn't a casual seating arrangement, it was strategic. When you're lying on a couch and everyone else is also lying on couches all facing the same central point, there's literally nowhere to hide. You can't sit in the back and hope nobody notices you. You can't excuse yourself to the bathroom and stay there for 20 minutes while you compose yourself. You're visible to everyone else in the room at all times, which means you're accountable for everything you do and say. It's like the Greeks invented the panopticon, except instead of prison surveillance, it was symposium surveillance, and instead of guards watching you, it was your drunk peers judging your performance. The number of couches varied by room size, but most androns seem to have accommodated somewhere between 7 and 15 guests. This is actually a pretty narrow range when you think about it. Fewer than 7 and you don't have enough people for interesting dynamics. It's basically just a few guys hanging out, not a proper symposium. More than 15 and the room gets too crowded. Conversations fragment into smaller groups, and you lose the collective experience that was supposedly the whole point. The Greeks figured out through trial and error that there's a sweet spot for how many people you can get drunk together before the logistics become unmanageable. Modern research on group dynamics would probably agree with their conclusions, though the Greeks got there through practical experience rather than psychology journals. What's particularly interesting about the couch arrangement is what it eliminated from the space. No chairs, no tables, no vertical furniture at all, really. Everything was horizontal. This was deliberate and ideological in ways that aren't immediately obvious if you're used to modern furniture conventions. In Greek society, sitting upright on a chair was associated with authority, control, and hierarchy. It's how you sat when you were conducting official business, making important decisions, or generally being a responsible citizen. Lying down, on the other hand, was associated with leisure, relaxation, and the temporary suspension of those normal social roles. By making everyone lie down, the symposium physically enforced a kind of equality that didn't exist anywhere else in Athenian society. Of course, this equality was somewhat fictional. The reality was that even lying down there were still hierarchies. Where you were positioned on the couches mattered. Who you were reclining next to mattered. The order in which you spoke mattered. The quality of the cushions you were given mattered. The Greeks were excellent at creating the appearance of equality while maintaining actual hierarchies through subtle mechanisms that everyone understood but nobody explicitly acknowledged. It's like claiming everyone in a company is equal while still having very clear org charts and salary bands. The symposium was democratic in theory, oligarchic in practice. The physical position of lying on your left side propped up on your left elbow, which was the standard symposium pose, is actually pretty uncomfortable if you maintain it for hours. Try it sometime. Your left arm starts to fall asleep. Your back gets sore. You can't really shift positions without it being obvious to everyone in the room. The discomfort was probably part of the point. It kept you aware of your body, aware of your physical presence in the space. You couldn't fully zone out or dissociate because your arm was going numb and you needed to adjust your position every few minutes. This meant you stayed engaged with what was happening around you, even if you were getting progressively more drunk. The Greeks had accidentally invented a sobriety mechanism through furniture design, though whether they realised this or just thought couches looked sophisticated is unclear. The andron was typically one of the nicest rooms in the house, which tells you something about how important symposia were to Greek social life. The floors were often decorated with intricate mosaics, geometric patterns, mythological scenes, sometimes just abstract designs that looked impressive. The walls might have frescoes or painted decorations. This wasn't utilitarian space. It was showpiece space, designed to impress guests and demonstrate the host's wealth and taste. You wouldn't serve cheap wine in a beautifully decorated andron any more than you'd serve gas station coffee in fine china. The space created expectations about what would happen in it, and those expectations influenced how people behaved. Lighting in the andron deserves more attention than it usually gets. These events happened in the evening after sunset, which meant they required artificial light. The Greeks used oil lamps, small clay or bronze vessels filled with olive oil with a wick sticking out. These didn't provide very much light by modern standards, certainly nothing like electric lighting. The result was that androns were dimly lit spaces where faces were visible, but details were softened by shadow. You could see expressions well enough to read emotional states, but not so clearly that every minor facial movement was analysed. The lighting created intimacy without complete exposure, which was probably ideal for the kind of evening the symposium was supposed to be. The dimness also meant that as people got more drunk and their facial expressions became less controlled, the shadows helped hide some of that deterioration. Early in the evening, when people were still relatively sober and composed, the lighting was sufficient to see everything clearly. Later, when someone was starting to slur their words or lose their train of thought, the shadows provided a kind of mercy, softening the visual evidence of their impairment. Whether the Greeks planned this or just got lucky with their lighting technology is impossible to say, but it worked to the symposium's advantage either way. The acoustics of the andron also mattered, though this probably wasn't something the Greeks consciously designed for. A room with stone or plastered walls and floors would create echo and reverberation, which meant sound carried well. Someone speaking in a normal voice from one couch could be heard clearly by someone on the opposite side of the room. This was good for facilitating conversation across the space, but bad for having private side conversations. Everything was public. Every comment could be heard by everyone. This reinforced the collective nature of the symposium and made it harder for small cliques to form within the larger group. You were all in this together, literally and acoustically. But let's back up to before anyone even got into the andron, because the Greeks had also ritualized the process of entering this space. The threshold between the outside world and the symposium room wasn't just a physical doorway. It was a symbolic transition that was marked by specific behaviours that everyone was expected to perform. This is where the whole shoe removal ritual comes in, and it's more significant than it initially appears. Removing your shoes at the entrance to the andron was mandatory. This wasn't a suggestion or a preference, it was a requirement that everyone followed. On the surface, this seemed like simple hygiene. Ancient Athens was dusty, dirty, and covered in things you wouldn't want to track into someone's nice house. Sandals that had been walking through streets where people dumped chamber pots and animals wandered freely were definitely not clean. So removing them before entering a room with expensive floor mosaics makes practical sense. But the Greeks being Greeks, they couldn't just leave it at that. They had to make it symbolic. The act of removing your shoes marked the transition from public to private space. In the streets and the agora and all the other public areas of Athens, you were a citizen with a specific social role and responsibilities. You were performing your identity for the broader community. But stepping out of your shoes meant stepping out of that public role and entering a different kind of space where different rules applied. It was like crossing a threshold into another world, except instead of putting on magic shoes like in a fairy tale, you were taking off your regular shoes to signal that normal reality was being temporarily suspended. Not quite as exciting as Dorothy clicking her heels, but the principle was similar. This symbolic dimension was reinforced by who actually removed your shoes. You didn't do it yourself. That would be too simple and too solitary an act. Instead, servants performed this task for arriving guests. They would kneel down, untie your sandals, and remove them for you while you stood there being attended to. This served multiple functions simultaneously. It was a display of the host's wealth. Look, I have enough servants that one of them can spend time just removing shoes. It was a gesture of hospitality. You're my guest, and I'm going to make sure you're properly prepared for the evening. And it created a moment of vulnerability where you had to accept help with a basic task, which subtly reinforced the idea that you were entering a space where normal self-sufficiency was temporarily set aside. The servants who handled this duty had a unique position in the whole symposium ecosystem. They were present for the entire evening, serving wine, cleaning up messes, handling various tasks, but they weren't participants in the same way the guests were. They existed in this liminal space, visible but not really seen, necessary but not acknowledged, and crucially, they were sober. While everyone else in the room was getting progressively more drunk, the servants remained clear-headed and aware of everything happening around them. This gave them a kind of power that probably went unrecognized by the drunk men they were serving. Think about what those servants witnessed. They saw who arrived sober and who arrived already having started drinking elsewhere. They heard every conversation, every argument, every philosophical debate and drunken confession. They saw who behaved well and who behaved badly, who could hold their wine and who couldn't, who said things they probably shouldn't have. They were like human recording devices, except the Greeks didn't think about them that way because they were slaves or lower-class workers who supposedly didn't matter. But information is power regardless of who holds it, and those servants held a lot of information that could be valuable or dangerous depending on how it was used. The servants could also predict how the evening would go based on subtle cues that the guests themselves probably weren't aware of displaying. Someone who arrived walking unsteadily or speaking too loudly was already too drunk and would likely cause problems later. Someone who seemed tense or angry was a risk for starting fights. Someone who was unusually withdrawn might be dealing with personal issues that would come out once the wine started flowing. The servants developed a kind of expertise in reading people that came from years of watching the same dynamics play out over and over. They could probably have written their own guide to symposium behaviour, though of course nobody asked them to, and they wouldn't have been literate anyway in most cases. The barefoot requirement had practical effects beyond the symbolic ones. Walking barefoot on cold stone or tile floors, and Greek floors were definitely cold, especially in winter, kept you grounded in physical reality in a way that you wouldn't be if you were wearing shoes. Your feet would get cold. You'd feel every texture of the floor surface. This sensory input was a constant reminder of your physical presence in the space, which might have helped counteract some of the dissociative effects of alcohol. Not enough to keep anyone sober, obviously, but perhaps enough to maintain a baseline level of bodily awareness that made the whole experience slightly less chaotic than it otherwise would have been. There's also something psychologically significant about being barefoot in a social situation. Shoes are armour in a small way. They protect you from the ground and create a barrier between you and your environment. Taking them off makes you literally more vulnerable. You can't run as easily. You can't fight as effectively. You're exposed in a way that you wouldn't be with shoes on. This physical vulnerability translated into social vulnerability. You were entering a space where you were expected to let your guard down, to be more open and honest than you would be in public. Starting that process by literally removing a layer of protection sent a clear message about what kind of evening this was going to be. The entry ritual also created a natural pause between arriving and participating. You couldn't just rush into the andron and start drinking immediately. You had to stop, remove your shoes, maybe have a brief exchange with the servant helping you, take a moment to adjust to the indoor environment. This transition time was probably useful psychologically. It gave you a moment to shift mental gears from whatever you'd been doing before to the mindset required for a successful symposium. You were leaving behind your work, your family responsibilities, your civic duties, and preparing to enter a space where the only expectations were that you drink, converse, and participate in whatever collective experience was about to unfold. The moment of transition was also when you got your first glimpse of the andron and could assess what kind of evening you were in for. How many people had already arrived? Who was there? What was the mood in the room? Was the wine already being served? All of this information was available in those first few seconds after you stepped through the doorway, and experienced symposium goers probably learned to read these signs quickly to calibrate their own behaviour accordingly. Walking into a room where everyone was already drunk and loud meant you needed to catch up quickly. Walking into a room where people were still relatively sober and conversing quietly meant you could ease into the evening more gradually. The physical layout of the entry process reinforced the exclusivity of the symposium. There was usually only one entrance to the andron, which meant everyone came in the same way, and was processed through the same ritual. You couldn't sneak in through a back door or arrive unnoticed. Your arrival was a public event, witnessed by everyone already present and by the servants managing the threshold. This visibility served as quality control. Nobody could claim they'd been invited if they hadn't actually been, because their arrival would have been noticed and questioned. It also meant that showing up late was noticeable and potentially embarrassing, which encouraged punctuality, or at least being fashionably late rather than actually late. Once you'd made it through the shoe removal ritual and stepped into the andron proper, you were committed. The symposium had begun for you personally, even if it had started hours earlier for others. You couldn't easily back out at this point without causing offence or looking foolish. The ritual of entry was also a ritual of commitment. By performing it, you were agreeing to participate in whatever happened next, whether that turned out to be an intellectual evening of philosophical discourse or a chaotic night of drinking games and arguments. The uncertainty was part of the appeal, or at least part of the experience. The andron's design also controlled movement in ways that shaped social interaction. Once everyone was on the couches, there wasn't much reason or opportunity to get up and walk around. The space was too confined for that, and standing up while everyone else was reclining would make you conspicuous in ways that were probably uncomfortable. So people stayed put for most of the evening, which meant you were stuck conversing with whoever was near you on the couches, unless the conversation became group-wide. This forced proximity was another aspect of the symposium's social engineering. You couldn't just talk to your friends and ignore everyone else. The space required you to engage with whoever you'd been placed near, which could lead to interesting conversations you wouldn't have had otherwise or awkward situations you couldn't escape from. Both were possible, and both probably happened regularly. The central placement of the crater was also significant architecturally. Having the wine-mixing vessel in the middle of the room meant everyone had equal access to it, and could see when it was being refilled, when the mixture was being adjusted, who was serving from it. This transparency prevented anyone from getting secretly better wine than others, a form of equality that the Greeks apparently valued even while they were perfectly comfortable with other kinds of inequality. The crater was also a focal point that drew the eye, which meant that even when you weren't actively paying attention to the wine, you were still aware of its presence. The room was literally organised around alcohol consumption, which tells you everything you need to know about the symposium's priorities. Some androns had additional architectural features that enhanced the experience. Decorated ceilings drew the eye upward when you were lying on your back. Windows were typically small or non-existent, which helped maintain the sense of the andron as a separate space cut off from the outside world. The doorway might be the only connection to the rest of the house, and that connection was guarded by servants and marked by the shoe removal ritual. Once you were inside, you were fully inside without visual or acoustic reminders of what was happening elsewhere. This isolation was probably important for maintaining the symposium's bubble of suspended social norms. The scale of androns is also worth considering. They weren't huge spaces. Most seem to have been roughly equivalent to a modern living room, maybe 15 by 20 feet, though sizes varied. This meant the room could get crowded, especially later in the evening when servants were moving around refilling cups and people were shifting on their couches. The proximity was deliberate. A larger room would have felt empty, and would have made conversation across the space difficult. A smaller room would have been claustrophobic and uncomfortable. The Greeks had apparently worked out the ideal dimensions for a room where you wanted people to feel connected but not trapped, intimate but not invasive. Temperature control was basically non-existent, which meant symposia were subject to the weather. In summer, the andron would get hot, especially with multiple bodies, oil lamps, and no air conditioning. In winter, it would be cold despite whatever heating methods the Greeks used. This lack of climate control probably affected the symposium experience in ways we don't fully appreciate. A hot room full of sweaty drunk men would have a very different atmosphere than a cold room where everyone was trying to stay warm. The Greeks just had to deal with it, which is a reminder that most of human history involved being uncomfortable about temperature, and there was nothing you could do about it except complain. The permanence of the andron's design is also significant. Unlike modern party spaces that can be reconfigured for different events, the andron was purpose-built and relatively fixed in its layout. You couldn't easily move the couches around or change the room's configuration. This meant every symposium in a particular andron followed roughly the same spatial pattern, which created consistency and tradition. People knew what to expect architecturally, which reduced one source of uncertainty, and allowed them to focus on the social and intellectual aspects of the evening. The space was predictable even when the conversation wasn't. What's particularly clever about the Andron's design is how it balanced competing needs. It had to be impressive enough to serve as a status symbol, but not so ornate that it overshadowed the actual symposium activities. It had to facilitate conversation while preventing the fragmentation of the group. It had to create intimacy while maintaining visibility. It had to be comfortable enough for a long evening, but not so comfortable that people fell asleep. Finding the right balance on all these dimensions simultaneously required either brilliant design insight or a lot of trial and error. The Greeks probably relied on both. The archaeological record shows that androns became more elaborate over time, which suggests an arms race of sorts among wealthy Athenians. If your neighbour had an andron with basic mosaics, you needed one with more intricate mosaics. If his had painted walls, yours needed better paintings. The space became a canvas for competitive display, which is very Greek and very human. We see the same dynamic today with home theatres and game rooms and whatever other specialised spaces people build to show off to their friends. The Greeks were just doing it with rooms specifically designed for getting drunk and talking about philosophy, which is both more and less sophisticated than modern equivalents depending on how you look at it. The relationship between the andron and the rest of the house is also interesting. In most Greek houses, the andron was separate from the women's quarters and from the everyday living spaces used by the family. This physical separation reinforced the social separation between the male public world and the female domestic world. The andron was a male space embedded within a larger domestic context, but carefully isolated from it. Women in the house knew symposia were happening but weren't supposed to be involved or even particularly aware of the details. This architectural segregation made the gender exclusivity of symposia literally built into the structure of Greek homes. The door to the andron could be closed, which provided acoustic privacy and reinforced the separation from the rest of the house. What happened in the andron was supposed to stay in the andron, at least in theory. The closed door was both practical, keeping the noise from disturbing others, and symbolic, marking the symposium as a distinct event with its own rules that didn't apply elsewhere. It was like a cone of silence, except instead of silence, it was a cone of wine-soaked conversation that nobody outside was supposed to know about in detail. The clean-up after a symposium must have been considerable, though this aspect rarely gets mentioned in historical sources because the elite men who wrote about symposia weren't the ones doing the cleaning. Spilled wine, food debris, possibly vomit if the evening went particularly badly, all of this had to be dealt with before the andron could be used again. The servants who handled this work saw the aftermath of symposia in ways that the participants didn't, which gave them yet another layer of insight into what actually happened as opposed to what people claimed happened. The physical evidence didn't lie, even if drunk men's memories did. The andron as an architectural form eventually spread beyond Athens to other Greek cities and even to places influenced by Greek culture. The design principles proved adaptable to different contexts while maintaining the core features: couches around a perimeter, central wine vessel, separation from other domestic spaces. This suggests that the Greeks had figured out something fundamental about what kind of physical space best supports their particular form of social drinking, and that insight was valuable enough to export along with other aspects of Greek culture. Modern attempts to recreate symposia, and there have been several by classical scholars trying to understand the experience better, always run into the problem that we can't actually recreate the social context. We can build a room that looks like an andron, arrange couches in the right configuration, serve wine mixed with water in a crater, but we can't recreate the class hierarchies, the gender exclusivity, the slavery, the specific social pressures, or the cultural assumptions that made the original symposia what they were. The space was important, but it was only one component of a much larger social system. Understanding the architecture gets us closer to understanding the symposium, but it can't get us all the way there. What the andron ultimately represents is the Greek talent for taking a basic human activity, in this case drinking together, and turning it into something architecturally and socially complex. They couldn't just drink in any old room. They needed a special room designed specifically for drinking, with particular features that shaped how the drinking and conversation unfolded. This impulse to formalize and systematize everything, even getting drunk with friends, is characteristically Greek. They applied the same analytical thinking to party spaces that they applied to temples and theatres. Whether this made the parties better or just more complicated is probably a matter of opinion. but it definitely made them more interesting to study 2,000 years later, which counts for something. Now let's talk about the actual substance that made all of this possible: wine. And not just any wine, but Greek wine, which was an entirely different beast from what you'd pick up at a modern wine shop. If you somehow transported a bottle of ancient Greek wine to the present day and tried to serve it at a dinner party, your guests would probably think you were trying to poison them. This stuff was thick, sweet, incredibly alcoholic, and had the consistency of syrup. Drinking it straight would be like chugging liqueur for hours, which explains why the Greeks looked at people who did that and said, "Yeah, those are barbarians." The whole concept of good wine in ancient Athens was wrapped up in economics, geography, status signaling, and cultural identity in ways that went far beyond just taste. Wine wasn't simply a beverage choice. It was a statement about who you were, how much money you had, and whether you understood the unwritten rules of Greek civilization. Serving the wrong wine at a symposium was like showing up to a formal event in the wrong clothes. People would notice, people would judge, and you'd hear about it later in ways that weren't pleasant. Greek wine production was serious business, both literally and figuratively. Vineyards required significant investment: land, labour, equipment, storage facilities. You couldn't just plant some grapes in your backyard and expect to produce symposium-quality wine. The best wines came from specific regions that had developed reputations over generations. Wines from Thassos, Lesbos and Chios were particularly prized, which meant they were also particularly expensive. Serving wine from one of these famous regions was like serving champagne from an actually famous French champagne house, rather than sparkling wine from wherever. The difference might not be obvious to someone who didn't know wine, but to the men at a symposium who definitely knew wine and would definitely judge you for it, the distinction mattered enormously. The age of the wine was another factor in this complex status equation. Older wines were generally considered better, which meant they were more expensive and therefore more impressive to serve. But storing wine for years required appropriate facilities, which required wealth. So serving old wine wasn't just about taste. It was about demonstrating that you had the resources to buy wine and then not drink it immediately, which is a very particular kind of flex. It's the ancient equivalent of buying expensive whiskey and letting it sit in your liquor cabinet for a decade just to show you can afford to ignore it. What made Greek wine particularly complicated was its physical properties. This wasn't clear, like wine that you could drink casually. It was concentrated, thick, and so high in alcohol content that modern wine experts estimate it was somewhere around 15 to 20% alcohol by volume, which is more like port or sherry than modern table wine. The thickness came partly from the grapes themselves and partly from production methods that sometimes included adding honey, herbs, or other ingredients to create specific flavours and effects. The result was something that needed to be diluted just to be drinkable, which is where the whole wine mixing ritual came in. The crater, that large mixing bowl sitting in the centre of the andron, was where the transformation happened. Wine and water would be combined in specific ratios that varied depending on the preferences of the host and the goals for the evening. The standard ratios that Greeks debated range from 1 part wine to 2 parts water on the strong side, to 1 part wine to 5 parts water on the weak side. Anything stronger than 1 to 2 was getting into dangerous territory that suggested you were either trying to get everyone catastrophically drunk very quickly, or you fundamentally misunderstood the symposium's purpose. Anything weaker than 1 to 5 was too cautious, and suggested you were a killjoy who didn't understand that some degree of intoxication was actually the point. The debates about proper mixing ratios were genuinely philosophical in nature. A weaker mixture meant conversations would stay more intellectual for longer, but you'd sacrifice some of the social bonding that came from shared vulnerability and lowered inhibitions. A stronger mixture meant you'd get to the emotional honesty and free-flowing ideas more quickly, but you'd also accelerate the descent into incoherent rambling and potential arguments. The host had to judge what kind of evening they wanted to create and mix accordingly, which was harder than it sounds because you couldn't exactly adjust on the fly once everyone had started drinking. The mixing process itself had ritual elements. It wasn't just dumping wine and water together and stirring. There was a specific order of operations, often accompanied by libations to the gods, because the Greeks couldn't do anything without involving divine oversight, apparently. The first mixing of the evening was ceremonial and set the tone for everything that followed. Getting this wrong would be noticed immediately by everyone present, which created pressure on the host to perform the ritual correctly. It's like being asked to make a toast at a wedding. There's a right way to do it, Everyone knows what the right way is, and if you mess it up, it's awkward for everyone. Water quality mattered too, though this gets less attention than it probably should. Not all water was equal in ancient Greece. Spring water was considered best, followed by well water, with rainwater as a distant third option. The water you used to mix your wine said something about your household's resources and attention to detail. Using bad water could ruin good wine, which was both a waste of money and a social disaster. It's the ancient version of buying expensive coffee beans and then brewing them with tap water that tastes like chlorine. Technically it works, but you've defeated the purpose. The serving vessels added another layer to this economic and social complexity. Wine would be served from the crater into individual cups, and those cups range from simple clay vessels to elaborate works of art made from precious metals. The quality of cup you were given wasn't random. It correlated with your status in the group and the host's assessment of your importance. Getting a fancy cup meant you were valued. Getting a basic cup meant you were there but not particularly special. Everyone could see what kind of cup everyone else had, which meant this hierarchy was visible and intentional. The Greeks had found yet another way to maintain social distinctions while pretending everyone was equal. The economic investment required to host a proper symposium was substantial when you add everything up. You needed good wine, which was expensive. You needed enough wine to keep everyone drinking for hours, which multiplied that expense. You needed appropriate mixing water. You needed serving vessels for however many guests you'd invited. You needed food to serve before the drinking started, because even the Greeks knew you shouldn't drink on an empty stomach, and that food needed to be good enough to match the quality of the wine. You needed oil for the lamps. You needed servants to manage everything. The total cost could be significant, which is why only wealthy men could regularly host symposia. This economic barrier to entry is important for understanding the symposium's role in Greek society. These weren't democratic institutions open to anyone who wanted to show up. They were exclusive gatherings of men who had the resources to participate in this particular form of leisure activity. The symposium reinforced existing class distinctions, even as it pretended to temporarily suspend them. You couldn't attend if you weren't invited. You wouldn't be invited if you weren't wealthy and educated, and you couldn't reciprocate by hosting your own symposium if you didn't have the money. The whole system was circular in a way that kept the same class of men rotating through the same social circles. But here's where it gets interesting, because the Greeks were very aware of this contradiction and built the symposium around managing it. The lying down position that everyone had to adopt was the most visible element of this management strategy. In normal Athenian life, social hierarchies were rigidly maintained and constantly performed. Wealthy men sat differently, dressed differently, spoke differently, moved through public space differently than poor men. These differences were markers of status that everyone recognized and respected. But at a symposium, all of that had to be temporarily set aside to create the conditions for the kind of free intellectual exchange that was supposedly the point of the gathering. The solution was to physically enforce equality through furniture. Make everyone lie down on couches in the same uncomfortable position, and suddenly a lot of those visible status markers disappear. A rich man lying on his side, propped up on his elbow, looks basically the same as a less rich man in the same position. The posture doesn't allow for much variation in how you present yourself. You can't sit up straighter to project authority. You can't stand to dominate the space. You're horizontal, slightly awkward, and fundamentally in the same position as everyone else in the room. It's enforced equality through architectural constraint, which is very Greek in its combination of idealism and practicality. Of course, the equality was somewhat theatrical. The Greeks maintained hierarchy even while lying down. They just did it more subtly. The most obvious mechanism was couch placement. In any andron, some positions were more prestigious than others. The couch closest to the door was generally the least desirable. Too much traffic, too much exposure to the outside, too far from the centre of action. The couches along the far wall, particularly the centre positions, were more prestigious. Being placed there indicated that you were important enough to be literally central to the evening's events. Everyone knew this, which meant everyone noticed where everyone else was positioned, which meant the seating arrangement was yet another way of performing and maintaining social hierarchies while pretending they didn't exist. The order of speaking was another subtle hierarchy. Not everyone spoke at once. That would be chaos. Instead, there was usually some kind of rotation or protocol for who spoke when. The exact rules varied, but generally speaking, more prestigious guests got to speak earlier and more often. Less important participants might have to wait their turn, which could mean waiting a long time if several people ahead of them decided to hold forth at length. Being asked to speak first or being given extended time to develop an argument was a mark of respect. Being consistently passed over or cut short was a message about your place in the pecking order. None of this was explicitly stated, but everyone understood it. The quality of service you received was another indicator. Servants would refill wine cups at different rates depending on whose cup it was. More important guests might find their cups topped off more frequently and with better wine if there were multiple qualities being served. Less important guests might have to wait longer or might receive slightly less attention. These differences were subtle enough that they could be denied if challenged, but obvious enough that everyone noticed them. It's social hierarchy expressed through service patterns, which is remarkably passive-aggressive when you think about it. Even the quality of the couch cushions could vary. Archaeological evidence suggests that some couches had better padding than others, which meant physical comfort was distributed unequally, even in a space supposedly dedicated to equality. Spending the evening on a lumpy, uncomfortable couch while the guy across from you lounged on something substantially more comfortable would be a constant physical reminder of relative status. The Greeks were nothing if not thorough in their maintenance of hierarchy, even when the entire purpose of the evening was supposedly to transcend it. What makes this whole system fascinating is that everyone involved knew it was performative. The Greeks weren't stupid. They could see that the equality was staged and that hierarchies persisted through subtle mechanisms, but they participated in the performance anyway because it served a useful function. The illusion of equality, even if everyone knew it was an illusion, created just enough social space for people to speak more freely than they could in normal contexts. It was like everyone agreeing to pretend something was true so they could all benefit from the pretense, which is surprisingly sophisticated social engineering for what was ostensibly just a drinking party. The physical discomfort of the reclining position actually contributed to this dynamic. As mentioned earlier, lying on your left side, propped up on your left elbow for hours is genuinely uncomfortable. Your arm falls asleep, your back gets sore, your position feels increasingly awkward as time passes, but everyone was experiencing this same discomfort, which created a kind of shared suffering that's weirdly bonding. When everyone in a room is dealing with the same physical annoyance, it creates solidarity. You're all in the same boat, quite literally in the same position, and that shared experience matters psychologically, even if you know the whole thing is being carefully managed to maintain hierarchies. The discomfort also kept people engaged. You couldn't fully relax into the couch and drift off because your physical position wouldn't allow it. You had to stay somewhat alert and aware of your body, which meant you stayed aware of the conversation even as the wine was affecting your judgment and inhibitions. The Greeks had accidentally or intentionally created a furniture arrangement that kept people participating even as they got drunk, which is actually pretty clever when you consider the alternative of everyone getting comfortable, drinking heavily, and then just falling asleep. The wine itself was the great equalizer in the sense that everyone was drinking the same stuff from the same crater. Unlike the differential service and couch quality and speaking order, the wine was genuinely shared equally. When the mixture was prepared, it didn't matter if you were the wealthiest man in Athens or just comfortable enough to be invited, you were all drinking the same wine-water combination. This created a kind of baseline equality that undercut some of the other hierarchical mechanisms. Whatever advantages wealth gave you in terms of couch placement and cup quality, you were still putting the same intoxicating substance into your body as everyone else, which meant you'd all be progressively impaired in similar ways. This chemical equality through shared intoxication was probably crucial to the symposium's function. Alcohol is a great leveler because it affects everyone eventually, regardless of status. A wealthy man who's drunk is just as likely to slur his words, lose his train of thought, or say something embarrassing as a less wealthy man who's drunk. The wine eroded the careful self-presentation that normally maintained class distinctions, which is exactly what the symposium was designed to do. The host could control the seating and the cups and the speaking order, but they couldn't control how alcohol affected people's brains, which meant there was at least one aspect of the evening that genuinely transcended hierarchy. The progression of a typical symposium followed a predictable arc that moved from structured hierarchy to chaotic semi-equality, and then back toward hierarchy the next morning. Early in the evening, when everyone was still relatively sober, the hierarchies were most visible and most carefully maintained. People spoke in appropriate order, deferred to higher status participants, kept their comments measured and intellectual. This was the symposium at its most civilized and most stratified. You could practically see the social rankings being performed through every interaction. As the wine started working, the hierarchies would begin to soften. People became more willing to challenge each other, to speak out of turn, to express opinions they might have kept to themselves when sober. The carefully maintained social distinctions started to blur as everyone's judgment deteriorated and inhibitions lowered. This was the sweet spot that the symposium was designed to reach, the point where hierarchy had relaxed enough for genuine exchange but hadn't completely dissolved into chaos. How long this sweet spot lasted depended on the strength of the wine mixture and how much everyone drank, but experienced hosts tried to extend it as long as possible. Later in the evening, as everyone got genuinely drunk, things could go in different directions. Sometimes the symposium would achieve a kind of egalitarian chaos, where everyone was equally impaired, and hierarchy ceased to matter, because nobody could maintain it anymore. Other times, old resentments or competition would surface, and the evening would turn contentious. Sometimes people would get emotional and confessional. Sometimes they'd just get sleepy and start nodding off on their couches. The loss of structure that alcohol brought could liberate or it could create problems, and there wasn't much predicting which way it would go on any given evening. The next morning would see a reassertion of normal hierarchies, possibly strengthened by whatever had happened the night before. If you'd embarrassed yourself while drunk, your status might have taken a hit. If you'd impressed people with your wit or wisdom even while drinking, your reputation might have improved. If you'd challenged someone higher status and made it work, you might have gained ground. If you'd challenged someone and failed, you might have lost ground. The symposium was supposedly a space outside normal social rules, but what happened there had real consequences for those rules once everyone sobered up. The economic aspect of all this is worth returning to because it shaped everything about how symposia functioned. The cost of hosting created an obligation system where invitations had to be reciprocated with counter-invitations. If someone hosted you at their symposium, you were expected to eventually host them at yours, which meant you needed to be able to afford to host. This created a closed loop where only people wealthy enough to participate in this reciprocal hosting system could remain part of the symposium circuit. If you couldn't afford to host, you'd stop getting invited to others' symposia, which would effectively exclude you from an important social network. This reciprocal hosting system also created competitive pressure. You didn't just need to host a symposium, you needed to host one that was at least as good as the one you'd been invited to, and preferably better. If someone served you excellent wine from Thasos, you couldn't serve them mediocre local wine when it was your turn to host. That would be insulting and would damage your reputation. So there was constant one-upmanship in terms of wine quality, food quality, and the overall impressiveness of the event. The symposium circuit became a kind of arms race of hospitality, which benefited wine merchants and nobody else. The wine merchants, incidentally, were doing very well from all of this. The demand for quality wine from wealthy Athenians hosting symposia created a robust market that connected Athens to wine-producing regions across the Mediterranean. Ships carried wine from Chios and Thasos and other famous regions to Athenian markets, where it was bought by men who needed it for social purposes rather than just personal consumption. This created price pressure that made good wine increasingly expensive, which made serving it increasingly impressive as a status signal, which increased demand further. It's basic economics, except driven by the need to impress drunk people with your beverage choices. Storage and preservation of wine was another expense and another status marker. Wine needed to be stored properly in sealed amphorae in cool, dark spaces if you wanted it to age well. This required storage facilities, which required space, which required property, which required wealth. Being able to casually mention that you were serving wine from 10 years ago implied you'd had the resources to buy it and store it for a decade without drinking it, which was a flex that everyone at the symposium would recognize and appreciate, or resent depending on their own financial situation and how competitive they were feeling. The whole economic structure of the symposium reinforced existing inequalities while creating the appearance of temporary equality. Rich men could afford better wine, better facilities, better everything, but once everyone was in the Andron lying on couches drinking from the same crater, those differences were supposed to matter less. Except they did matter, because the better wine still tasted better, the more expensive cup still looked more impressive, and everyone knew who could afford to host regularly and who couldn't. The symposium was a masterclass in maintaining hierarchy through ritualized equality, which is either very clever or very cynical depending on your perspective. What's interesting is that the Greeks seemed genuinely committed to the ideal of equality, even as they undermined it in practice. The philosophical discussions at symposia often touched on justice, fairness, the nature of the good society, topics that required at least theoretical commitment to egalitarian values. The fact that these discussions happened in a space that was structurally unequal but performed equality created a productive tension. You could argue about what a just society should look like while experiencing the gap between ideal and reality in real time. Whether this made the philosophical discussions more insightful or just more hypocritical is debatable. The enforced horizontal position was in some ways the perfect symbol for the whole enterprise. Everyone was literally on the same level, lying down rather than standing or sitting in ways that would indicate hierarchy. But horizontal is only equal if you ignore everything else, where you're positioned horizontally, what you're lying on, what you're drinking from, who's paying attention to you, who gets to speak when. The Greeks took a genuinely egalitarian gesture, making everyone adopt the same physical position, and surrounded it with so many hierarchical mechanisms that the egalitarianism became more symbolic than real. But the symbolism mattered, because it created the ideological framework within which the symposium could function as something more than just a drinking party. Looking at the symposium through the lens of wine economics and enforced equality reveals the complexity of what the Greeks were trying to do. They wanted intellectual exchange that required some degree of social equality. They wanted to maintain their normal class hierarchies. They wanted to get drunk but not too drunk. They wanted structure but also spontaneity. They wanted everyone to participate but also wanted to control who participated and how. These competing goals created tensions that shaped everything about how symposia were organized and experienced. The fact that the system worked as well as it did for as long as it did suggests the Greeks had found something sustainable, even if it was built on contradictions. The enforced equality created just enough space for genuine conversation and idea exchange. The maintained hierarchies ensured that the symposium didn't threaten the broader social order. The wine provided the chemical intervention necessary to make both of these things happen simultaneously. And the economic investment required to participate kept the whole thing exclusive enough that it felt special and important, rather than just another evening with friends. Modern attempts to create similar spaces, whether graduate student happy hours or professional networking events, or any other gatherings where alcohol is supposed to facilitate connection and conversation, rarely achieve the same balance. We tend to either maintain hierarchies too rigidly, which stifles genuine exchange, or abandon them too completely, which creates chaos. The Greeks had figured out how to walk this tightrope, possibly because they'd had centuries to refine the practice, and possibly because they were comfortable with contradictions in ways we find difficult. The symposium was simultaneously egalitarian and elitist, structured and spontaneous, intellectual and intoxicated. That it managed to be all of these things at once is the real achievement, and the wine economics and horizontal enforcement were the mechanisms that made it possible. Here's something that needs to be said clearly about the symposium. It was aggressively, deliberately, structurally male. Not just male in the sense that it happened to be mostly men who showed up, but male in the sense that the entire institution was designed around the exclusion of respectable women. Wives weren't invited, daughters weren't invited, mothers weren't invited, sisters, female cousins, any woman who was related to or married to anyone present, all excluded. This wasn't an oversight or a coincidence. It was policy, and it shaped everything about what the symposium was and what could happen there. The exclusion of respectable women from symposia was so fundamental to the institution that the Greeks barely bothered to explain it. It was just understood that certain women didn't belong in that space, the same way it was understood that you mixed your wine with water and lay on couches rather than sitting in chairs. These were the basic parameters within which the symposium functioned, and questioning them would be like questioning whether you needed walls to have a room. The answer was obvious to everyone involved, even if the reasoning behind it was more complicated than they might have admitted. What makes this exclusion particularly interesting is what it enabled. By removing the women who had the most social power over these men in normal contexts, their wives, their mothers, their daughters whose reputations they were responsible for, the symposium created a space where different rules could apply. You could say things at a symposium that you absolutely could not say at home. You could behave in ways that would be unacceptable in front of your family. You could discuss topics that were off limits in mixed company. The absence of these women wasn't just about keeping them out. It was about creating a vacuum that made certain kinds of male behavior possible. Think about the practical implications. In regular Athenian domestic life, women were constantly present, constantly watching, constantly serving as informal enforcers of social norms and family reputation. A wealthy Athenian man's wife had a vested interest in his behavior because his actions reflected on her and their children. His mother had even more invested because she'd raised him, and his conduct said something about her success as a parent. His daughter's marriage prospects could be affected by his reputation. All of these women had reasons to care about what he said and did, and their presence served as a check on his behavior. Remove them from the environment, and you remove that check. The symposium exploited this absence systematically. Once you were in the andron with the door closed and no respectable women anywhere nearby, the normal constraints didn't apply. You could get drunk, not just slightly tipsy, but genuinely intoxicated to the point of saying and doing things you'd never do sober. You could argue passionately about controversial topics. You could express opinions that would scandalize your wife or embarrass your daughters. You could discuss your personal life, your relationships, your failures and insecurities in ways that would be impossible with family members present. The absence of women who knew you in your domestic role meant you could temporarily be someone else. The paradox that the Greeks either didn't notice or didn't care about is that this male-only space spent a lot of time discussing topics that directly involved women. Love was a major theme at symposia. So were relationships, marriage, desire, the nature of attraction, proper conduct between men and women. The philosophical dialogue that Plato titled Symposium is literally about love and features extended discussions of romantic and sexual relationships. But these discussions happened in a space where the women who were supposedly being discussed weren't present to offer their own perspectives or challenge the conclusions being reached. The men were theorizing about women without any women in the room to tell them they were wrong. This created some truly bizarre situations. Imagine a group of men progressively getting more drunk, pontificating about what women want or how relationships should work or the nature of love, while the only women in the room were servants and entertainers who weren't invited to contribute to. The philosophical discussion. It's like a modern panel on women's issues composed entirely of men who've decided they don't actually need to hear from any women to understand women's experiences. The Greeks apparently saw no problem with this arrangement, which tells you something about their assumptions about who had worthwhile knowledge and whose perspectives mattered. The topics that couldn't be discussed honestly in front of respectable women were numerous and varied. Anything sexual was obviously off limits in mixed company. Greek society had strict rules about what could be said about sex and desire in contexts where respectable women were present, which meant those topics were reserved for male-only spaces like the symposium. Politics could also be dicey depending on the specific issues involved and whose families had interest in different outcomes. Personal failures, business problems, disputes with other citizens, all of these things were easier to discuss when the women who might be affected by your reputation weren't listening. But it went deeper than just avoiding certain topics. The presence of wives and daughters would have fundamentally changed the dynamic of the entire evening. Men would have needed to maintain the social performance that they maintained in normal domestic contexts. They couldn't fully relax, couldn't fully let their guard down, couldn't be as honest or as vulnerable as the symposium required them to be. The whole point of getting drunk together was to strip away the usual social masks and see what was underneath. You can't do that effectively when some of the people in the room are precisely the ones you most need to maintain those masks around. The wives of the men attending symposia had to have opinions about this arrangement, though we don't really have access to what those opinions were because Greek women didn't leave extensive written records and Greek men didn't seem particularly interested in documenting what their wives thought about symposia. But it's hard to imagine that women were uniformly thrilled about their husbands spending entire evenings drinking with other men in spaces where they weren't allowed. The potential for bad behavior was obvious. The lack of accountability was built into the system, and the next morning would bring both a hungover husband and possibly some gossip about what he'd said or done while drunk. Some wives probably accepted this as just how things worked. Men had their symposia, women had their own social spaces and activities, and the separation was part of the natural order. Others might have resented it but recognized they didn't have the power to change it. Some might have actively used the information that filtered back from symposia through servants or through their husbands' own indiscretions, for their own purposes. The symposium created information asymmetries that clever women could potentially exploit. If you knew what your husband had said while drunk, you had leverage. If you knew what other men had said about their own situations, you had intelligence that could be valuable. The servants present at symposia, particularly female servants, occupied an interesting position in this whole system. They were women, so their presence technically violated the male-only principle, but they weren't respectable women, so somehow it didn't count. This distinction reveals a lot about how the Greeks categorized people. A woman's respectability, which was tied to her social class, her family connections, her sexual history, and her relationship to male citizens, determined whether her presence mattered for the purposes of defining a space as male only. Female slaves and lower-class women could be present without compromising the essential maleness of the symposium because they weren't the kind of women whose opinions carried social weight. These female servants saw everything. They were in the room for the entire evening, serving wine, clearing plates, handling various tasks as needed. They heard every conversation, witnessed every drunken argument, saw every embarrassing moment. And unlike the male guests, they remained sober throughout because they were working. This gave them a clarity of observation that nobody else in the room possessed as the night progressed. They were recording devices, essentially, except the information they recorded stayed in their heads and could potentially be used in ways that the drunk men talking hadn't anticipated. The power dynamics here are worth considering. These were women with minimal formal power. They were slaves or low-status workers with no legal standing and no official voice in Greek society. But they had information, and information is always valuable. They knew who said what, who behaved how, what arguments happened, what confessions were made. That knowledge could be traded, sold, or used strategically. It could be deployed to gain favor, to avoid punishment, or to navigate the complex social hierarchies they existed within. The symposium created opportunities for these women to accumulate the kind of knowledge that wealthier, more powerful people might want access to. Whether female servants actually exploited these opportunities is impossible to know with certainty, because they don't show up in the historical record in ways that would tell us. But the structural conditions existed for them to do so, and humans generally use whatever leverage they have available. It seems unlikely that women who spent their lives navigating a system that gave them almost no formal power would pass up opportunities to gain informal power through information control. The symposium handed them that opportunity on a regular basis. Then there were the heterai, which is a Greek term that's usually translated as courtesans, but covered a range of women who were educated, cultured, and available for male entertainment in ways that respectable women weren't. These women were explicitly invited to symposia for their ability to converse, perform music, dance, and generally make the evening more entertaining. Their presence was considered appropriate precisely because they existed outside the normal social categories that applied to wives and daughters. They weren't women whose reputations needed protecting, so men could interact with them without the constraints that would apply in other contexts. Heterai occupied a unique space in Greek society. They had more freedom than respectable women in some ways. They could move through public spaces, engage in intellectual discussions, accumulate their own wealth. But they also lacked the social protection and security that came with being a respectable married woman. They were dependent on maintaining relationships with wealthy men who would pay for their time and company. The symposium was their workplace, essentially, and they needed to perform successfully there to maintain their income and status. The skills required to be a successful hetaira were considerable. You needed to be beautiful enough to be desirable, educated enough to participate in philosophical and literary discussions, musically talented enough to provide entertainment, socially adept enough to navigate the complex dynamics of a room full of drunk competitive men, and emotionally intelligent enough to manage relationships with multiple clients simultaneously. Not exactly an easy job, and the Greeks don't seem to have given much thought to how difficult it must have been to perform all of these roles while maintaining the appearance of enjoying yourself. What heterai brought to symposia was a female presence that didn't trigger the same constraints as respectable female presence would have. Men could flirt with them, could be physical with them, could discuss sexual topics in front of them without violating social norms. The heterai were supposed to be sophisticated enough to participate in these interactions without being shocked or offended. They provided a kind of social lubrication that complemented the chemical lubrication of the wine. They made it easier for men to relax and be less guarded because there was at least some female energy in the room, even if it was carefully controlled. And commodified female energy. The musicians and dancers who performed at symposia were in similar positions to hetairai, though potentially with less education and cultural capital. Their job was to entertain, to provide auditory and visual interest, to fill silences and enhance the atmosphere. They were decoration, essentially, but decoration that breathed and watched and remembered. Like the servants, they were sober witnesses to drunk behaviour, which gave them knowledge that could be valuable or dangerous depending on how it was used. The presence of these non-respectable women created a weird dynamic where the symposium was simultaneously male-only and not male-only. The men could maintain the fiction that they were in an exclusively male space having exclusively male conversations, but there were women present observing everything. The cognitive dissonance this required apparently didn't bother the Greeks, or if it did, they didn't mention it in the text that survived. Perhaps it was enough that the women who were present were the right kind of women, the kind whose presence didn't count socially and whose observations didn't carry official weight. This dual system of women, respectable women excluded, non-respectable women included, reveals the Greek approach to gender in sharp relief. Women weren't simply one category of people who were treated uniformly. They were divided into subcategories with different rules, different permissions, different constraints. A man's wife couldn't attend his symposium, but a hetaira could. Both were women, but only one kind of woman counted for the purposes of defining the space as male. The distinction was based entirely on social construction, rather than any inherent difference, which makes it both arbitrary and rigidly enforced. The topics discussed at symposia reflected this strange gender dynamic. Men would talk about love and desire and relationships while being served by women and entertained by women, and sometimes sleeping with women who were present, but they wouldn't include those women as participants in the theoretical discussions. The women were bodies and performers and service providers, but not intellectual equals whose input would be valuable. This allowed the men to theorize about women as abstract concepts while ignoring the actual women right there in the room, who might have complicated their theories with messy reality. Some of the philosophical dialogues that came out of symposia are genuinely strange when you consider this context. Men arguing about the nature of a love while drunk and surrounded by women they were paying to be there created a specific kind of discourse that was divorced from actual relationship dynamics. The conclusions they reached about what women wanted or how love worked were essentially theoretical exercises unconstrained by actual input from women who might have said, "That's not how any of this works." Its philosophy is intellectual. Game-playing rather than genuine inquiry, which might explain why some of it aged so poorly. The morning after a symposium would bring different reckonings for different people. The male guests would wake up hungover and possibly embarrassed, would have to piece together what they'd said and done, would maybe need to do some damage control. The wives at home would hear some version of what happened, filtered through gossip networks and servant communication and their husbands' selective disclosure. The hetairai and musicians would move on to the next job, carrying their memories and observations with them. The servants would clean up the mess and file away what they'd witnessed for potential future use. The exclusion of respectable women from symposia wasn't unique to Athens or even to Greece. Male-only drinking spaces are a near-universal human phenomenon that shows up across cultures and time periods. What's distinctive about the Greek version is how systematized it was and how integral to their cultural and intellectual life. The symposium wasn't just where men went to get away from women. It was where philosophy happened, where political alliances were formed, where cultural values were debated and refined. Excluding women from this space meant excluding them from participating in the creation of Greek culture in fundamental ways. The women who were excluded would have developed their own knowledge and their own perspectives through different channels. The domestic sphere that was their domain had its own intellectual life, its own forms of cultural transmission, its own ways of understanding the world. But those forms didn't get written down and preserved the way symposium conversations did, because the men who did the writing weren't present in women's spaces and didn't value what happened there enough to record it. So we have extensive records of drunk men theorizing about life, while we have almost nothing about what their wives and daughters thought about any of it. The hetairai who attended symposia had their own perspective that probably differed significantly from both the male guests and the respectable women who were excluded. They saw men behaving badly, heard men contradicting themselves, witnessed the gap between men's public personas and their private behaviour. They understood male psychology in ways that wives might not because they saw men in contexts where different aspects of personality emerged. This knowledge made them valuable as companions, but also potentially threatening, because they knew too much about too many important men. Some hetairai became famous in their own right. Aspasia, who was associated with Pericles, is the most well-known example. These women managed to leverage their position into something approaching social power, using their intelligence and cultural knowledge and connections with powerful men to carve out space for themselves. But they were exceptions. Most hetairai remained relatively anonymous, known to their clients but not to history, providing entertainment and companionship and sexual services to men who went home to wives who weren't supposed to know the details. The whole system depended on maintaining boundaries that everyone agreed were important, even as they regularly crossed them in practice. Respectable women weren't supposed to know what happened at symposia, but of course they knew in general terms and probably in specific terms for events involving their own husbands. Hetairai weren't supposed to form real emotional attachments to clients, but of course some did because humans are humans. Servants weren't supposed to repeat what they heard, but of course some did because that information was valuable. The boundaries were there. They were enforced socially and sometimes legally, but they were also permeable in ways that created complexity the Greeks seemed to prefer not to acknowledge. Looking at the symposium's gender dynamics from a modern perspective is complicated. On one hand, the exclusion of women from important cultural spaces is obviously problematic and limited the development of Greek thought in significant ways. On the other hand, the Greeks were products of their time and culture, and judging them by modern standards is arguably unfair. They developed a system that made sense within their framework, even if that framework was based on assumptions about gender that we no longer accept. What's interesting is how the absence of women shaped the presence of men. Without their wives and daughters watching, men could be more vulnerable, more honest, more willing to admit uncertainty and failure. The symposium allowed for emotional expression that wasn't possible in other contexts, where men were expected to maintain control and project strength. In this sense, the exclusion of certain women created space for men to be more than the limited version of masculinity that public life demanded. Whether this was worth the cost of excluding women from cultural participation is debatable, but it's at least more complex than simple misogyny. The servants and hetairai and musicians who were present complicate the narrative further. These women weren't passive victims, they were actors with their own agency, making decisions about how to navigate the system they were part of. They used the resources available to them, accumulated knowledge and connections and sometimes wealth, and shaped their own lives within the constraints they faced. Their presence at symposia meant they had access to cultural and intellectual currents that respectable women didn't, even if they weren't supposed to participate as equals. Whether this access was worth the price of being categorized as non-respectable is something only they could have answered. The modern equivalent might be something like a business conference or industry event, where important networking and deal-making happen, in contexts that are nominally open to everyone but practically exclude certain groups through various mechanisms. The formal exclusion is gone, but the informal exclusion persists through subtler means. People who don't fit the dominant demographic of the space, whether because of gender, race, class, or other factors, find themselves either not invited or not comfortable or not able to participate effectively. The symposium's explicit exclusions have been replaced by implicit ones, which might actually be worse because they're harder to identify and challenge. What the symposium ultimately reveals is how humans create spaces that serve multiple functions simultaneously. It was a drinking party and a philosophical salon, and a networking event and a pressure release valve and a site of cultural production. Excluding women was essential to making it work in the specific way the Greeks wanted it to work, but that exclusion also shaped what it could produce. The absence of women's voices in symposium discourse meant Greek philosophy developed in a particular direction, prioritizing certain questions and perspectives while ignoring others. We're still dealing with that inheritance, still working within philosophical frameworks that were created in male-only spaces by drunk men who thought they were figuring out universal truths, but were actually producing quite specific, limited perspectives. The invisible women, the wives and mothers and daughters who weren't allowed in the andron, shaped the symposium through their absence. They were the censors who weren't present, the witnesses who weren't watching, the voices that weren't heard. Their exclusion created the negative space that made the symposium possible, and the women who were present, the servants and hetairai and musicians, shaped it through their invisible labour and their unacknowledged observations. Together, these two groups of women, the excluded respectable and the included non-respectable, were essential to the symposium's function, even though the institution was ostensibly all about men. The absence was presence, the invisibility was a form of visibility, and the whole contradictory mess somehow produced one of Western civilization's foundational cultural institutions. The Greeks could make anything complicated, apparently, even getting drunk and talking with friends. The musicians who performed at symposia occupied one of the strangest positions in the entire Greek social hierarchy. They were absolutely essential to the event's success, visible to everyone in the room, performing skills that required years of training, and yet they were somehow supposed to be simultaneously present and absent. They were there to be seen and heard when performing, but invisible and silent when it came to the actual substance of the evening, the conversations, the debates, the confessions, the arguments. It's like being hired to play background music at a therapy session, and then being expected to forget everything you overheard. Not exactly a realistic expectation, but the Greeks apparently thought it would work out fine. These women, and they were almost always women in this role, had a front row seat to everything that happened at symposia, while being treated as if they weren't really there at all. The men drinking and philosophizing and making fools of themselves would carry on as if the musicians were furniture. Expensive, skilled, necessary furniture that could play the aulos or the lyre, but furniture nonetheless. The cognitive dissonance required to perform intimate conversations in front of people you were pretending weren't present is impressive. It's the ancient Greek version of having deeply personal phone conversations in an Uber, and acting like the driver can't hear you because you're not making eye contact. The music itself served multiple functions that went beyond simple entertainment. On the most basic level, yes, it provided pleasant sounds to enhance the atmosphere. Greek symposia weren't silent affairs. They were full of conversation, laughter, argument, and general noise, and music added another auditory layer that made the whole thing feel more festive and sophisticated. But the music also did something more subtle and more important. It created acoustic cover for the social awkwardness that inevitably emerged when you put competitive drunk men in a room together for hours. Think about how this worked in practice. Someone would make an argument that landed poorly, creating an uncomfortable silence. The music would fill that silence, giving everyone a moment to regroup without the silence becoming unbearable. Someone else would say something they probably shouldn't have, and the music would provide a sonic cushion that softened the impact slightly. A conversation would hit a natural pause, and instead of awkward quiet while everyone tried to think of what to say next, there would be music keeping the energy moving. The musicians were essentially the social glue that held the evening together, except nobody acknowledged that role explicitly, because acknowledging it would mean admitting they were actually present and paying attention. The musicians had to develop a sophisticated sense of when to play, when to pause, when to change tempo or volume, when to shift to different kinds of music based on the mood in the room. This required constant attention to what was happening around them, and quick judgment about how to respond musically. It was improvisational in the sense that they couldn't fully plan their performance in advance. They had to react to the symposium as it unfolded, which meant they were intensely engaged with the social dynamics even while pretending not to be, which is exhausting just to think about. The instruments they played required serious skill. The aulos, a double reed instrument that sounded somewhat like an oboe, was particularly difficult and required years of training to master. The lyre was slightly more accessible, but still demanded significant practice to play well. These women weren't amateurs picking up instruments for fun. They were professional musicians who had invested substantial time developing their abilities. The fact that all this skill was deployed in service of providing background music for drunk men's philosophical discussions says something about how Greek society valued women's artistic labour versus men's intellectual labour. The performance itself was physically demanding in ways that don't always get acknowledged. Playing the aulos required continuous circular breathing, which is hard enough when you're fresh and rested, but becomes genuinely difficult when you've been performing for hours. The lyre required finger strength and dexterity that would fatigue over a long evening. And the musicians were expected to perform for the entire duration of the symposium, which could last many hours, while remaining standing or in positions that allowed them to play. No lying on comfortable couches for them. That privilege was reserved for the men who were paying for their services. What makes the musicians' position particularly interesting is the information asymmetry they created. The men at the symposium were getting progressively more intoxicated as the evening went on, which meant their memory of events would be increasingly impaired and fragmented. They might remember the general outline of what happened but would lose details, might confuse the order of events, might completely forget entire conversations or incidents. The musicians, on the other hand, remained sober throughout because they were working. They couldn't perform adequately if they were drunk, and nobody was paying them to drink. So they experienced the entire evening with clear perception and would remember it accurately. This meant the musicians had power, even if it was power they couldn't exercise openly. They knew what was actually said versus what people would claim was said. They knew who behaved badly, who got emotional, who said things that contradicted their public positions, who made promises they'd later want to deny. This information was valuable. In a society that ran on reputation, and where a man's standing could be damaged by revelations about his private behaviour, having accurate memories of what happened at symposia was a form of currency. The musicians could potentially use this information in various ways. They could trade it, telling one client about another client's behaviour in exchange for better payment or treatment. They could use it as leverage to protect themselves if a client tried to cheat them or mistreat them. They could build relationships with powerful men by demonstrating their discretion, showing that they could be trusted not to repeat what they'd witnessed. Or they could selectively share information in ways that advanced their own interests or those of people they favoured. The possibilities were numerous, and while we don't have detailed records of musicians actually doing these things, the structural conditions existed for it to happen. The risk for musicians was that they had to be very careful about how they used whatever leverage their knowledge gave them. Openly threatening a powerful man with revealing embarrassing information would be dangerous. They had no legal protection and very little social protection, so retaliation could be swift and severe. But subtle deployment of knowledge, a carefully chosen comment that lets someone know you remembered something they'd forgotten, a piece of information shared at the right moment with the right person, that could be done without openly challenging anyone's power. The discretion that musicians were expected to maintain was both a professional requirement and a survival skill. If you developed a reputation for gossiping about your clients, you'd stop getting hired. Symposia required confidentiality. What happened there was supposed to stay there, at least officially, and musicians who violated that confidentiality were violating the unspoken rules of the institution. But complete silence about everything they witnessed wasn't realistic or probably even expected. The question was what information got shared, with whom, and in what context. Skillful musicians would have learned to navigate this carefully. The relationship between musicians and hetairai at symposia is worth considering, because they often work the same events but in slightly different capacities. Hetairai were there for conversation and companionship as well as potential sexual services, which meant they had to engage more directly with the male guests. Musicians could maintain slightly more distance. They were performing, not conversing, which gave them some protection from having to interact personally with drunk men who might become aggressive or inappropriate. But both groups were in similar positions of being present but not really participants, valued but not respected, necessary but not equal. There was probably an informal network among these women where they shared information about which clients were reliable, which ones were trouble, which symposia to accept invitations to and which to avoid. Musicians who worked the same circuit would have had opportunities to compare notes, literally and figuratively, about what they'd experienced and what they'd learned. This network would have been invisible to the men attending symposia, who probably didn't think much about what these women discussed among themselves or how they prepared for events. The training required to become a symposium musician was substantial, and someone had to pay for it. Some women might have been trained by family members who were also musicians. Others might have been slaves whose owners invested in musical training because skilled musicians commanded higher prices. Some might have been hetairai, who added musical ability to their repertoire of skills to make themselves more marketable. Regardless of how they learned, the investment in training was significant, which means there was economic calculation involved in creating this workforce of female musicians for male entertainment. The economics of being a symposium musician were probably complicated. Payment would depend on your skill level, your reputation, the wealth of the host, the length and importance of the event. Successful musicians could potentially earn decent money, though they'd have to work regularly to maintain income since there was no salary or stable employment. Less successful musicians might struggle to get enough work or might have to accept lower payments that barely covered their expenses. And all of this was happening in a context where women had limited economic options and limited control over their own earnings, especially if they were slaves. The visibility of the musicians created its own problems. Unlike the servants who could move around the andron somewhat invisibly while performing their tasks, musicians were positioned where everyone could see them. They were on display, which meant their appearance mattered. They needed to be attractive enough to be pleasant to look at, because the Greeks cared about aesthetics in everything, but not so attractive that they became a distraction from the symposium's main activities. They needed to dress appropriately, maintain good posture while performing, manage their facial expressions to look engaged but not too interested in what was being said around them. This performance of simultaneous visibility and invisibility required constant management. You had to be present enough that your music enhanced the atmosphere, but not so present that you drew attention away from the male guests and their conversations. You had to look like you were paying attention to your performance, but not like you were paying attention to anything else happening in the room. You had to appear content and professional regardless of what you were actually hearing or how long you'd been standing there playing. It's the ancient version of service workers having to maintain a pleasant expression while dealing with difficult customers, except extended over many hours and requiring musical performance throughout. The physical positioning of musicians in the andron placed them at the edges of the space, visible but peripheral. They weren't in the centre where the crater sat and where attention was focused. They were off to the side, providing their services from positions that allowed them to see and hear everything without being obviously part of the action. This spatial arrangement reinforced their social position, necessary to the event but not central to its purpose, contributing to the atmosphere but not to the substance. What the musicians witnessed over the course of their careers must have given them a comprehensive education in male behaviour that few other women in Greek society had access to. They saw men at their worst, drunk, emotional, aggressive, vulnerable, foolish. They saw the gap between public personas and private realities. They heard men express opinions and beliefs that contradicted what they said in public forums. They witnessed the formation of alliances, the breaking of friendships, the making of promises that would or wouldn't be kept. They accumulated knowledge about the men who ran Athenian society that was probably more accurate than what most Athenian citizens had access to. This knowledge made musicians dangerous in subtle ways that the Greeks might not have fully appreciated. They knew too much about too many important people. They'd seen patterns of behaviour, understood personality quirks, recognised vulnerabilities. In a different social system, this knowledge could have been leveraged into formal power. In Athens, where these women had minimal legal rights and status, it could only be used informally and carefully. But informal power is still power, and careful use of information is still use. The musicians' memories were never recorded in any systematic way, which means we've lost access to a significant source of information about how symposia actually functioned. The written accounts we have are all from male participants who were drunk and whose memories were impaired, and who had reasons to present events in particular ways. The musicians' accounts, what they saw, what they heard, how they interpreted the behaviours they witnessed, would give us a very different picture. But those accounts don't exist in the historical record because nobody thought to ask these women what they remembered or valued their perspectives enough to record them. This makes musicians invisible archivists of Greek culture in a literal sense. They archived experiences in their memories, but those memories weren't transcribed into permanent form. They knew things about Greek society, culture, and individual men that would be valuable to historians, but that we can never access because the information died with them. It's a loss we can't fully calculate because we don't know what we're missing, but it's certainly substantial. The symposium literature we have is incomplete not just because some texts were lost, but because one entire category of observer, sober female witnesses, was never considered worth documenting. The influence that musicians could have on reputations despite their lack of formal power is worth considering more carefully. In a society that operated significantly on reputation, and where a man's standing could affect his political influence, business opportunities and social connections, having your reputation damaged could be genuinely harmful. Musicians who shared accurate accounts of how someone had behaved at a symposium, if they shared this information strategically, could affect how that person was perceived by others. A reputation for losing control when drunk, for saying foolish things, for being overly emotional or aggressive, these could all be damaging in various ways. The musicians didn't need to make public announcements or formal accusations. A quiet word to another client, a carefully phrased comment to another musician who would pass it along, a knowing look at the right moment. These subtle communications could plant seeds that would grow into reputation problems. And because the musicians were supposed to be invisible, and their observations weren't supposed to count, men might not even realize that their reputations were being shaped by these women they dismissed as background decoration. The music itself could be deployed strategically in ways that affected symposium dynamics. Playing louder or faster could energize conversations that were flagging. Playing softer or more slowly could calm situations that were getting too heated. Changing to different types of music could shift moods. The musicians had some control over the emotional atmosphere of the evening through their musical choices, even if they couldn't control the content of conversations. This was subtle power, but real power, and skilled musicians would have learned how to use it. There's something darkly amusing about the whole situation when you step back and look at it objectively. The Greeks thought they were creating sophisticated intellectual spaces where the finest minds could gather to explore profound questions about existence, virtue, and the good life. And they were doing this in front of female musicians who were treated as if they weren't really there, but who were actually the most sober, observant, and memory-capable people in the room. The supposed intellectual heavy hitters were getting drunk and might not remember their brilliant insights in the morning, while the supposedly unimportant background music providers were stone sober and would remember everything perfectly. The irony is almost too perfect. Modern parallels exist in any situation where service workers are present during events, but treated as if they're not really there. Bartenders at business networking events, servers at political fundraisers, drivers for executives, assistants in meetings, all of these people hear and see things while being socially invisible. They know more about what's actually happening than they're given credit for, and they probably use that information in various ways that the people they're serving don't fully appreciate. The symposium musicians were doing the ancient version of this same dynamic. The emotional labor required from musicians was considerable and completely unacknowledged. They had to perform not just musically, but emotionally, appearing pleased to be there, interested in their work, unaffected by anything happening around them. If they felt bored, tired, uncomfortable, or upset by something they witnessed, they couldn't show it. The performance of pleasant professional disengagement had to be maintained throughout. This is exhausting in ways that people who haven't done this kind of work often don't understand. The musicians also had to navigate the sexual dynamics that were always present at symposia. As women in a male space where inhibitions were lowered and heterosexual desire was openly discussed, they were potentially objects of that desire. They had to manage this carefully, being friendly enough to not seem cold or off-putting, but distant enough to maintain professional boundaries, unless they were also functioning as heterae, and those boundaries were different. The line could be hard to walk, especially as the evening progressed and the men got drunker and potentially more aggressive in their attentions. The question of what happened when musicians made mistakes is interesting to consider. Professional musicians would rarely make obvious errors, but it must have happened occasionally. A wrong note, a fumbled phrase, a broken string at an inopportune moment. How did symposium guests react to this? Did they even notice, given that they were drinking and focused on conversation? Did they care if they did notice? Or did the music fade so completely into background that errors went unremarked unless they were truly egregious? We don't really know, which is itself telling about how these women's work was valued. The musicians' relationship with the other servants at symposia would have been complex. They were all working the same event but in different capacities and with different relationships to the guests. Musicians might have had slightly higher status than general servants because their skills were more specialized, but they were all fundamentally in positions of serving wealthy men who had power over them. They would have needed to coordinate to some degree. Servants needed to know when to refill wine without disrupting musical performances. Musicians needed to know when food was being served so they could adjust their playing accordingly. One aspect that's easy to overlook is the sheer physical endurance required for this work. Standing for hours while playing an instrument, maintaining focus and quality of performance, staying sober and alert while everyone else got progressively more intoxicated, this is demanding. The musicians couldn't complain about being tired or ask for breaks in the way that modern workers could. They were there for the duration, and they needed to maintain professional standards throughout regardless of how they felt physically. The Greeks don't seem to have given any thought to whether this was reasonable to expect. The contrast between how symposia treated musicians and how Greek culture theoretically valued music is stark. The Greeks considered music one of the essential elements of a good education. They believed it shaped character and had moral significance. They incorporated it into religious ceremonies, military activities, and civic festivals. Music mattered to them in profound ways, but the women who actually performed music at symposia were treated as functionally invisible. The abstract concept of music was valued while the actual musicians were disregarded. It's the kind of contradiction that the Greeks excelled at maintaining without apparent discomfort. The musicians' knowledge extended beyond just what happened at individual symposia. They would have seen patterns across multiple events and multiple hosts. They'd know which men consistently behaved certain ways when drunk, which friendships were genuine versus performative, which philosophical positions were sincerely held versus just argumentative postures. This meta-knowledge about Athenian society and culture would have been genuinely valuable for understanding how things actually worked versus how they were supposed to work. But again, nobody asked them and nobody recorded what they knew. The lack of written accounts from musicians means we're missing not just factual information, but also interpretive insight. How did these women understand what they were witnessing? What did they think about the philosophical discussions happening around them? Did they find the ideas interesting, boring, obviously flawed? Did they have their own views on love, virtue, the good life that might have differed from or complicated what the men were arguing about? We'll never know because their perspectives weren't considered worth preserving. There's a real possibility that some musicians were quite well educated and could have contributed substantively to symposium discussions if they'd been invited to do so. Hetairai were sometimes famously educated and cultured. Some musicians might have had similar backgrounds. They might have known the literary references being made, understood the philosophical concepts being debated, even had insights that would have enriched the conversation. But they were there to play music, not to participate in the intellectual exchange, so whatever they might have contributed remained unexpressed. The symposium needed musicians to function properly, but couldn't acknowledge that need in ways that would grant those musicians real status or value. They were simultaneously essential and dismissible, visible and invisible, present and absent. This contradiction was built into the structure of the institution and apparently didn't bother the Greeks enough to change it. The musicians just had to work within this contradictory framework and make the best of their position. Looking at the musician's role in symposia reveals another layer of the system's complexity. The symposium wasn't just about men drinking and talking. It was about creating a specific kind of social space that required multiple categories of workers and participants, all performing specific roles. The musicians were one piece of this larger mechanism, providing services that made the whole thing work while being denied recognition for their contribution. They were the invisible infrastructure that supported visible male intellectual performance, which is a role women have played throughout history in various contexts. The fact that these women influenced reputations and possibly even cultural outcomes without anyone acknowledging their influence is both fascinating and frustrating. They had power without having power, impact without recognition, knowledge without voice. They shaped Greek culture from the margins while being treated as marginal to the culture they were helping create. Their memories constituted an alternative archive of what actually happened at symposia, but that archive was never transcribed or preserved or taken seriously by the people who controlled what got recorded and remembered. The musicians at symposia were witnesses to the creation of Western philosophy and culture, while being excluded from participation in that creation. They heard the conversations that became the dialogues that influenced intellectual thought for millennia, but their own thoughts about those conversations were never considered worth recording. They performed the labour that made the symposium possible while being treated as if they weren't really there. They remembered what the drunk men forgot while being dismissed as unimportant. And somehow all of this was considered normal and acceptable by everyone involved, or at least by everyone whose opinions were recorded for posterity. The legacy of these silent witnesses is invisible precisely because they were treated as invisible. We can't recover what they knew, can't hear their voices, can't access their interpretations of events they witnessed. But we can acknowledge that there was a whole perspective on Greek symposia that existed and that we've lost, and that this loss makes our understanding of Greek culture incomplete in ways we can't fully remedy. The musicians were there. They saw everything. They remembered. And then they disappeared from history, taking their memories with them. leaving us with only the accounts of the drunk men they served. Every symposium had one. The guy who drank cup for cup with everyone else, went through the same progression of wine mixtures, participated in the same toasts and games, but somehow remained unnervingly clear-headed while everyone around him descended into progressively less. Coherent versions of themselves. He wasn't abstaining, that would be obvious and socially awkward. He was drinking, visibly drinking, matching the pace of the group, but the wine didn't seem to affect him the same way it affected everyone else. By the third hour, when other men were slurring their words and losing their trains of thought, this guy was still speaking in complete sentences and remembering what people had said 2 hours earlier. It was unsettling. It was impressive. And it fundamentally changed the dynamics of the evening. The Greeks didn't have a specific term for this person as far as we know, but they definitely recognized the phenomenon. In a culture where symposia were central to social life and where most men attended them regularly, everyone knew someone who could hold their wine with disturbing effectiveness. And everyone also knew that having this person at your symposium created a particular kind of tension that wouldn't exist if everyone was getting equally drunk at roughly the same pace. The sober observer among the intoxicated participants was a wild card that could make the evening more interesting or more dangerous depending on various factors. The most basic aspect of this dynamic was memory. When you're getting drunk, your ability to form and retain memories deteriorates progressively. This is just how alcohol affects the brain. It impairs the mechanisms that move experiences from short-term to long-term memory storage. So the drunker you get, the less reliable your recollection of the evening will be. You might remember the general outline of what happened but lose specific details. You might confuse the order of events. You might have complete gaps where you have no memory at all of certain periods. This is normal and expected when you're consuming significant amounts of alcohol over several hours. But if one person in the room isn't experiencing this same memory impairment because they're staying relatively sober despite drinking, that person has a significant advantage. They're going to remember everything. Every conversation, every argument, every confession, every stupid thing anyone said, every embarrassing moment, all of it will be stored in their memory with much greater clarity than anyone else's. The next morning, when everyone else is trying to piece together what happened based on fragmentary recollections and asking each other, "Did I really say that?" this person will know. They'll have the receipts, so to speak. They'll be the definitive source of information about what actually occurred. This created a power dynamic that was both subtle and significant. Information is valuable in any social system, but it's particularly valuable in a society like ancient Athens, where reputation mattered enormously, and where things said in private could damage you publicly if they became known. The person who remembered what everyone said while drunk had leverage over those people, even if they never explicitly used it. The mere fact that they knew could be enough to influence future interactions and relationships. You'd be more careful around them, more conscious of not wanting to give them additional ammunition, more eager to stay on their good side. The Greeks were aware of this dynamic, which is why the presence of someone who stayed sober created anxiety as well as admiration. On the one hand, it was impressive. The ability to consume large quantities of wine without becoming obviously impaired demonstrated a kind of physical superiority that Greeks respected. It showed strength, self-control, genetic advantage, all things that mattered in their value system. On the other hand, it was threatening. This person was operating under different conditions than everyone else. They had capabilities that put them at an advantage. They were, in a real sense, predatory, watching and remembering while others were vulnerable and exposed. The title of this chapter, Sober Predator Among Drunk Prey, isn't hyperbolic. That's genuinely how this dynamic functioned. The person who stayed clear-headed had tactical advantages over everyone else. They could read the room better, adjust their behavior based on what was happening, manipulate conversations in subtle ways that drunk people wouldn't notice. They could ask leading questions to get people to reveal things they wouldn't reveal sober. They could present arguments that sounded convincing in the moment, but that sober reflection would reveal as flawed. They could essentially hunt for information or advantage while everyone else's defenses were lowered. The question of how some people could drink heavily without getting as drunk as others is interesting from a biological perspective. Alcohol tolerance varies significantly between individuals based on genetics, body size, metabolic rate, and drinking experience. Someone with high natural tolerance or who drank regularly enough to build up acquired tolerance could consume the same amount of alcohol as someone else and experience much milder effects. The Greeks didn't understand the biochemistry behind this. They didn't know about enzymes and liver function and blood alcohol concentration. They just observed that some people could drink more than others without apparent impairment and considered it a personal quality rather than a biological characteristic. There were also techniques for reducing alcohol's effects that experienced drinkers might have known about. Eating substantial food before drinking water between cups of wine, pacing yourself carefully, all of these would help someone stay more sober than their companions who were drinking enthusiastically without such precautions. The Greeks knew that drinking on an empty stomach was a bad idea, which is why symposia typically happened after the evening meal. But how much you'd eaten, what you'd eaten, how recently you'd eaten, all of this could affect how drunk you got, and someone who managed these factors carefully could maintain an advantage. The competitive element can't be overlooked, because Greek men were competitive about everything, and drinking was no exception. When it became apparent that one person was staying more sober than others, some participants would take this as a challenge. They'd try to outdrink the sober person, to force them into the same state of impairment everyone else was experiencing. This was partly about ego. Nobody wanted to be the lightweight who got drunk first, and partly about restoring equilibrium to the group. If everyone was equally drunk, the vulnerability was shared. If one person was sober, they had an unfair advantage that needed to be eliminated. This could lead to drinking contests that were ostensibly about fun and games, but were actually about social control. The group would pressure the sober person to drink more, drink faster, drink stronger mixtures. Sometimes this worked, and the previously sober person would finally succumb to the cumulative effects of alcohol. Other times it didn't work, and the person's apparent immunity to intoxication would become even more pronounced and more unsettling. You can only watch someone drink cup after cup while remaining articulate and coordinated for so long before it starts to seem almost supernatural. The Greeks believed in divine intervention and magical abilities, so excessive alcohol tolerance might have been interpreted as having some kind of special blessing or curse. The social dynamics around the sober person would shift as the evening progressed, and the gap between their state and everyone else's became more obvious. Early in the evening, when everyone was still relatively together, it might not be noticeable that one person was handling the wine better than others. But by several hours in, when most people were obviously drunk, anyone who was still clearly sober would stand out dramatically. This visibility created choices about how to behave. The sober person could try to fake being more drunk than they were to blend in and avoid making others uncomfortable, or they could lean into their sobriety and use it strategically. Faking drunkenness is actually quite difficult to do convincingly if you're sober, because you have to remember to make all the small errors and adjustments that drunk people make naturally. You need to slightly slur words, lose your thread occasionally, become more emotional or less filtered, move with slightly less coordination. And you need to do all of this consistently over hours while actually remaining clear-headed enough to monitor and maintain the performance. It's exhausting and requires constant attention. Most people who tried to fake being drunk probably weren't very good at it, and experienced symposium goers would likely recognize the performance for what it was. Alternatively, the sober person could just be honest about their state, but this created its own problems. Admitting you weren't as drunk as everyone else while they were getting increasingly impaired would make you an obvious outsider to the shared experience. The symposium was supposed to be collective, everyone drinking together, everyone lowering their inhibitions together, everyone being vulnerable together. Someone who wasn't participating in the vulnerability while benefiting from others' diminished judgment was violating the implicit social contract. They were taking without giving, observing without being observed, remembering without being remembered. This asymmetry was fundamentally unfair in ways that would bother people, even if they couldn't articulate exactly why. The tactical advantages of staying sober at a symposium were numerous and varied. At the most basic level, you could simply enjoy watching other people make fools of themselves, which is a form of entertainment that humans have appreciated throughout history. There's something inherently amusing about watching people who think they're being brilliant reveal themselves to be much less impressive than their self-image. Drunk people say and do ridiculous things, and if you're sober enough to fully appreciate the absurdity, it's quite a show. But beyond entertainment, there were practical benefits. You could steer conversations in directions that served your interests. You could ask questions that would elicit useful information from people whose judgment was impaired. You could make alliances or break them based on what you learned while people were speaking more freely than they would sober. You could identify who was genuinely clever versus who just seemed clever because everyone was drunk. You could figure out who your real friends were versus who was just being friendly because of the wine. The symposium became a kind of diagnostic tool for understanding people's true natures when you remained clear-headed enough to analyze what you were seeing. The information gathered while others were drunk could be deployed strategically the next day and beyond. If someone had revealed something embarrassing or compromising, you could use that knowledge as leverage in future interactions. Not necessarily through explicit blackmail, that would be too crude and risky, but through subtle references that let the person know you remembered, and they should perhaps be accommodating. Greek society ran on networks of favours and obligations, and having information about someone's private behaviour or opinions was currency in that system. Mockery was another use for the memories accumulated while staying sober. Greek men enjoyed verbal sparring and making fun of each other. It was a form of social bonding and a way of establishing pecking orders within groups. If you remembered foolish things someone had said or done while drunk, you had material for mockery that could be deployed at appropriate moments. This wasn't necessarily malicious, though it could be, but was often just part of the general competitive banter that characterized male social interaction in Athens. Being the one who remembered gave you an advantage in these verbal contests. The psychological burden of being the sober person was probably substantial, though. You had to watch your friends and acquaintances deteriorate over the course of the evening, becoming less coherent and less rational, while remaining convinced they were still making perfect sense. You had to listen to the same arguments repeated multiple times with increasing volume and decreasing logic. You had to witness people embarrass themselves and know they'd regret it tomorrow, but be unable to stop them without revealing your own sobriety. You had to manage your own behaviour carefully to avoid giving away that you were much less drunk than everyone around you. All of this while remaining engaged enough to participate in conversations and activities without standing out as suspiciously sober. There was also an element of loneliness to being the sober observer. Everyone else was sharing an experience of progressive intoxication, and you were excluded from that shared experience even while physically present. You couldn't fully relate to what they were feeling or how they were perceiving things because your brain chemistry was different from theirs. You were isolated by your sobriety, watching from the outside even while sitting among the group. This separation could be useful for your purposes, but it probably wasn't particularly enjoyable on an emotional level. The next morning was when the sober person's role became most important and most powerful. Everyone else would wake up with varying degrees of hangover and varying levels of memory about what had happened. They'd be trying to reconstruct the evening, figure out what they'd said, assess whether they'd damaged any relationships or reputations. They'd be vulnerable and uncertain. And the sober person would be the authority, the one with clear recollections who could tell everyone what had actually occurred. This position as the keeper of truth about the previous evening gave enormous social power. You could be honest and tell people exactly what had happened, even if it was embarrassing for them. You could be kind and downplay their worst moments, giving them a face-saving version of events. You could be selective, sharing some information while withholding other bits. You could be manipulative, shading your account in ways that served your interests or damaged your rivals. The choice was yours, and whatever you said would be taken as relatively authoritative because you were known to have been more sober than anyone else. People would approach the sober person with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. They wanted to know what had happened, but were also worried about what they might learn. The conversation might go something like, "So, was I very bad last night?" And the sober person's response would shape how the drunk person understood their own behaviour and its social consequences. This gave the sober person significant influence over reputations and relationships, even though they weren't making official pronouncements or formal judgments, just sharing their recollections of events. The accuracy of these recollections would vary depending on how sober the person actually was and how reliable their memory happened to be. Someone who was slightly drunk might remember the general outline correctly, but miss details or misinterpret motivations. Someone who was completely sober would have better recall, but might also have their own biases affecting how they interpreted and reported what they'd seen. The point isn't that the sober person's version was necessarily objective truth, it's that it would be treated as more reliable than anyone else's version, because everyone else was known to have been more impaired. The social ecosystem of symposia had to account for the reality that someone would usually be less drunk than others and would therefore have this kind of power. Men who attended symposia regularly would develop strategies for dealing with this. Some might cultivate relationships with the typically sober person to ensure friendly treatment in their recounting. Others might try to avoid saying anything too compromising even while drunk, maintaining some level of control over their speech even as their judgment deteriorated. Still others might embrace the chaos and accept that whatever happened while drunk would be revealed the next day, taking a nothing-to-hide approach that preempted being ashamed of revelations. There was probably also a rotation of who was the sober person at different symposia. Someone who held their wine well at one event might get caught off guard at another and end up being the drunk fool while someone else remained clear-headed. This rotation would prevent any one person from accumulating too much power through always being the sober observer. It would also create a kind of mutually assured destruction. If you mocked someone for their drunk behavior, they might do the same to you the next time your positions were reversed. This could promote a culture of relative mercy, where people didn't weaponize their memories too aggressively, because they knew they'd eventually be vulnerable in the same way. The existence of the sober observer also created pressure to moderate behavior even while drunk. If you knew someone would remember everything you said and did, you might be more careful about what you revealed or how you behaved, even as the wine was lowering your inhibitions. This internal tension between the desire to let go and the need to maintain some control probably characterized a lot of symposium experience for regular participants. You wanted to enjoy the freedom that intoxication provided, but you also knew there would be consequences if you went too far, and someone would be there to witness and remember your transgressions. The competitive drinking that sometimes emerged when people tried to get the sober person drunk could lead to dangerous levels of alcohol consumption. The Greeks were aware that excessive drinking could be harmful. They had concepts of moderation and appropriate limits. But in the heat of a symposium, with social pressures and masculine competition, and the momentum of the evening all pushing toward more drinking, people could exceed safe levels. The person who stayed sober might be the only one in the room capable of recognizing when things were getting dangerous, but they might not have the social capital to stop the momentum even if they wanted to. There's also the possibility that some people stayed sober deliberately for strategic reasons beyond just having high alcohol tolerance. Someone planning to gather information, form alliances, or otherwise advance their interests might choose to pace their drinking carefully to maintain an advantage. This would be calculated manipulation rather than just biological luck, and it would be even more unsettling if people realized it was happening. The Greeks valued cleverness and strategic thinking, but using these qualities to exploit your friend's drunken vulnerability might be seen as crossing a line from admirable cunning into something darker. The persona of the sober predator walking among drunk prey is perhaps overly dramatic for what was usually just someone with better alcohol tolerance than others, but the power dynamics were real even if they weren't always exploited aggressively. Having clear memories when others' memories were impaired, having good judgment when others' judgment was compromised, having the ability to observe and analyze when others were too drunk to do either. These advantages were significant in a social system where information and reputation mattered as much as they did in Athens. The psychological game-playing that happened once people realized someone was staying sober could get quite complex. The drunk people might start testing the sober person to see how much they'd noticed or what they remembered. They might make references to earlier events to see if the sober person corrected or clarified them. They might try to gauge whether the sober person was judging them or found them amusing or was taking notes for future use. The sober person, meanwhile, might be trying to hide how much they'd observed and remembered, or might be deliberately showing their awareness to establish dominance, or might be somewhere in between these strategies. The morning after conversations where the sober person served as the source of truth about the previous evening must have been fascinating in their social dynamics. People would be negotiating their understanding of what happened, trying to align their fragmentary memories with the sober person's account, deciding whether to accept or push back on potentially embarrassing revelations. The sober person would be making real-time decisions about what to share, how to frame it, which details to emphasize or minimize. Both sides would be performing a complex social dance around the fundamental asymmetry that one person knew more than the others about shared experiences. The institution of the symposium depended on a degree of collective amnesia to function properly. If everyone remembered everything they said and did while drunk, the symposium would be too dangerous to participate in. The risk to reputation would be too high. But if one person remembered everything, that collective amnesia was broken and the risk wasn't equally distributed. The sober person had protection through knowledge, while everyone else was exposed through forgetfulness. This inequality wasn't necessarily fatal to the symposium's function, but it changed the calculus of participation in ways that would make some people uncomfortable. Looking at the sober symposium goer from a modern perspective reveals patterns that are still relevant. We still have social contexts where some people drink heavily, while others stay relatively sober, and the same dynamics play out. The sober person has advantages through clarity and memory. Others feel exposed and possibly resentful of those advantages. Competition emerges around trying to get everyone to the same level of intoxication. The next day brings reckonings where the sober person's version of events carries more weight than drunk people's memories. The specific setting has changed. We're not lying on couches in Athens, but the human dynamics are remarkably similar. What the Greeks added to this universal pattern was their characteristic tendency to systematize and ritualize it. They created a formal institution around drinking together, with rules and expectations and cultural significance. The sober person wasn't just some guy who didn't get drunk. They were a recognized element of the symposium's social ecosystem, playing a role that everyone understood even if it wasn't officially defined. The Greeks took the basic human reality of differential alcohol tolerance and incorporated it into their larger cultural structure in ways that made it more complex and more interesting than it might otherwise have been. The sober predator among drunk prey was both a feature and a bug of the symposium system. A feature because having someone who remembered accurately could be useful for settling disputes or reconstructing important conversations. A bug because the power asymmetry created tensions that undermined the supposed equality and collective experience that the symposium was meant to provide. The Greeks, characteristically, didn't resolve this contradiction. They just lived with it, allowing the symposium to contain both the ideal of shared vulnerability and the reality of differential capacity, both the promise of collective amnesia and the threat of someone remembering everything. It's messy and contradictory and very Greek, and it probably made symposia more interesting even as it made them more complicated. The philosophical discussions that happened at symposia were sold to participants as profound intellectual exchanges where the great minds of Athens would explore fundamental questions about existence, virtue, and the good life. This was the marketing, essentially, the official justification for why wealthy, educated men were spending entire evenings getting drunk together. But the reality was usually quite different from the ideal. What actually happened was more like intellectual performance art crossed with competitive sport, where the goal wasn't so much to discover truth as to demonstrate that you were clever enough to argue convincingly about anything, regardless of whether you believed it or had any actual expertise in the subject. The Greeks loved debate the way some cultures love team sports. They enjoyed the back and forth, the clever argumentation, the strategic deployment of logic and rhetoric to defend positions or attack opponents' reasoning. This wasn't unique to symposia. Debate was central to Greek political life, legal proceedings, and education. But the symposium added alcohol to the mix, which changed the character of debate in specific and predictable ways. The wine didn't make people smarter or more insightful. What it did was make them more confident, more willing to take intellectual risks, more likely to say things they'd normally keep to themselves, and progressively less capable of coherent argumentation as the evening wore on. The typical progression of symposium philosophy followed a pattern that anyone who attended these events regularly would have recognized. Early in the evening, when everyone was still relatively sober, the discussions would be fairly controlled and intellectual. People would present actual arguments with premises and conclusions. They'd reference recognized authorities and philosophical schools of thought. They'd engage with each other's points in good faith, at least mostly. This was philosophy at its best. Intelligent people reasoning together about important questions. It probably didn't happen at every symposium, but when it did happen, it was likely in these early hours before the wine had fully kicked in. As people consumed more wine, the quality of argumentation would start to shift in interesting ways. The first few cups of wine would often make people more creative and bold in their thinking. They'd propose ideas they might have been too cautious to suggest while completely sober. They'd challenge conventional wisdom more aggressively. They'd connect concepts in novel ways that sober reasoning might have avoided as too speculative. This was actually productive in some cases. The wine was lowering inhibitions not just socially but intellectually, allowing for freer thinking that could occasionally generate genuine insights. The Greeks apparently understood this, which is partly why they valued symposia as sites of philosophical innovation. But there's a narrow window between bold enough to think creatively and too drunk to think coherently, and most symposia would pass through that window as the wine kept flowing. The arguments that had seemed brilliant an hour ago would start to become confused and circular. People would lose track of their own points mid-sentence. They'd contradict themselves without noticing. They'd repeat the same argument multiple times with increasing volume, as if loudness could compensate for the deteriorating logic. Someone would challenge a claim. The original speaker would try to defend it but get tangled up in their reasoning, and instead of admitting the confusion, they'd just assert their position more forcefully. Philosophy as contact sport indeed. When you can't win through logic, win through stubbornness and volume. The competitive element was always present but became more pronounced as sobriety decreased. Greek men were raised to compete, to win, to demonstrate superiority over their peers. They competed athletically, politically, poetically, and they definitely competed philosophically. A symposium discussion wasn't just a friendly exchange of ideas. It was a contest where there would be winners and losers, where your performance would be evaluated by everyone present, where doing well enhanced your reputation and doing poorly damaged it. This competitive framework meant that even when people were genuinely trying to work through philosophical questions, they were also trying to look impressive while doing it. The citation of authorities was a major part of the competitive performance. Homer was the ultimate authority. Every educated Greek could quote passages from the Iliad and Odyssey from memory. The pre-Socratic philosophers, the lyric poets, the tragedians, all of these provided material for citation and reference. But here's the thing. Most people who cited these sources at symposia probably didn't understand them as deeply as they pretended to. They'd memorized key passages during their education, they knew which quotes were considered important or impressive, and they deployed them strategically to demonstrate their cultural literacy. It was intellectual peacocking, essentially, showing off your educated background rather than engaging seriously with the ideas. This doesn't mean everyone who cited Homer was faking it. Some symposium participants genuinely knew their classical literature and could engage with it meaningfully. But others were performing knowledge they didn't really have, trusting that their peers wouldn't call them out because everyone was playing the same game. As long as you could quote accurately and apply the reference somewhat appropriately to the discussion at hand, you'd get credit for being educated regardless of whether you'd thought deeply about what the passage actually meant. It's similar to how people in modern contexts will quote famous thinkers they've never actually read, relying on second-hand knowledge and hoping nobody asks follow-up questions that would reveal the superficiality of their engagement. The wine served as performance-enhancing drugs for this intellectual sport in specific ways. The first few cups would boost confidence and creativity, making people more willing to jump into debates and propose ideas. This was genuinely useful for getting discussions started and keeping them energetic. But subsequent cups would start undermining the quality of the performance, while the participants remained convinced they were doing brilliantly. This is the tragicomic core of drunk philosophy. Your subjective experience is that you're making profound points with devastating logic, while the objective reality is that you're increasingly incoherent and repetitive. The gap between how smart you feel and how smart you're actually being widens progressively with each cup of wine. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from being drunk that makes you think you've solved problems that have puzzled humanity for centuries. You'll be lying on your couch at a symposium, several hours and many cups of wine into the evening, and suddenly you'll have what feels like a breakthrough insight about the nature of justice, or the good life, or whatever topic is under discussion. It will seem brilliantly clear to you in that moment. You'll articulate it to the room with the conviction of someone who's just discovered fire. Everyone else, being similarly drunk, might even agree that yes, you've definitely figured it out, this is the answer. And then the next morning you'll wake up and realize that your profound insight was either completely obvious, completely nonsensical, or had been articulated better by Heraclitus a century earlier. The Greeks were aware of this phenomenon. They knew that wine-soaked wisdom often didn't survive contact with morning sobriety, but they kept having these discussions anyway, partly because occasionally something genuinely valuable did emerge from the chaos, and partly because the performance itself was enjoyable, regardless of whether it produced lasting philosophical insights. The symposium was entertainment as much as intellectual work, and watching or participating in competitive drunk debating was apparently entertaining enough to justify the whole enterprise, even when it didn't result in advancing human understanding. The ability to defend absurd positions was particularly valued. This might seem counterproductive. Why would you want to argue for things you don't believe or that are obviously wrong? But the Greeks saw this as a demonstration of argumentative skill. Anyone could defend a reasonable position with good evidence. The real test of your rhetorical and logical abilities was whether you could make a compelling case for something ridiculous. If you could do that, it showed you understood argumentation at a deep level and could deploy it strategically regardless of the material you were working with. It was sophistication in the original sense, sophistry as skilled argument that wasn't necessarily connected to truth. This created situations where symposium participants would deliberately take positions they didn't actually hold just to see if they could defend them successfully. Someone would argue that injustice was better than justice, or that pleasure was the only good, or that the gods didn't exist, or whatever other controversial or absurd claim they could think of. The point wasn't to convince anyone these positions were correct. It was to show you were clever enough to make them sound plausible. Your peers would then try to dismantle your argument, and you'd defend against their attacks, and the whole thing would become a kind of intellectual gladiatorial combat where victory went to whoever could maintain their position longest or most convincingly. The problem with this approach to philosophy is that it prioritizes performance over truth-seeking. If the goal is to win the debate rather than to figure out what's actually correct, you're incentivized to use whatever argumentative techniques work, regardless of whether they're intellectually honest. You'll use logical fallacies if they're effective, you'll appeal to emotion when reason isn't working, you'll misrepresent your opponent's position to make it easier to attack. You'll shift definitions mid-argument to escape contradictions. All of these tactics were probably deployed at symposia, especially as the evening progressed and people's reasoning abilities deteriorated, but their competitive drive remained strong. The audience for these debates, the other men at the symposium, would serve as judges and cheerleaders. They'd react to good points with approval, bad arguments with derision, clever comebacks with appreciation. This created performance pressure on the debaters. You weren't just trying to convince your opponent, you were trying to impress everyone watching. This meant you might take risks you wouldn't take in a private conversation, make bolder claims, use flashier rhetoric. The audience dynamic turned philosophy into spectacle, which made it more entertaining but probably less productive as actual inquiry. Different symposia would have different intellectual standards depending on who attended and what kind of culture the host established. Some would maintain relatively high levels of serious philosophical engagement. Others would devolve into shouting matches where whoever was loudest won. Most probably fell somewhere in between. Moments of genuine insight mixed with periods of competitive posturing, mixed with intervals of incoherent rambling, as everyone got progressively more drunk. The variance would be high from event to event and even within individual events as the evening unfolded. The relationship between wine consumption and argumentative quality was probably non-linear in interesting ways. Stone sober, people might be too inhibited to engage fully. Slightly drunk, they'd become more engaged and creative. Moderately drunk, they'd be confident but still mostly coherent. Very drunk, they'd be confident but increasingly incoherent. Extremely drunk, they'd be repeating themselves and probably not making sense at all. The optimal level of intoxication for quality philosophical discussion was probably somewhere in that moderate range, but maintaining that level would be difficult when wine was continuously available and social pressure encouraged continued drinking. Some participants were probably better than others at navigating this progression. They'd pace themselves to stay in the productive zone longer. They'd recognize when they were getting too drunk to argue effectively and would either moderate their consumption or shift from being a primary debater to being part of the audience. Others would lack this self-awareness or self-control and would keep drinking and arguing even as their performance deteriorated embarrassingly. The next morning would bring reckonings where people who'd made fools of themselves while thinking they were being brilliant would have to confront the gap between their self-perception and others' observations. The topics discussed at symposia range from traditional philosophical questions about virtue and knowledge to more immediate concerns about politics and social life, to abstract speculation about cosmology and metaphysics. The Greeks didn't have rigid boundaries between different domains of inquiry the way modern academic disciplines do, so a single evening might touch on ethics, politics, natural philosophy, religion, aesthetics, and psychology without anyone thinking. This was odd. Everything was connected in Greek thought, and wine-lubricated discussion could jump between topics freely. Love was a frequent subject, which makes sense given the homosocial character of symposia and Greek cultural attitudes about relationships. These discussions often featured in philosophical literature set at symposia. Plato's Symposium is the most famous example. But the literary versions were probably cleaned up significantly from what actual drunk men discussing love would have sounded like. The dialogues we have are witty, structured, and insightful. Real symposia discussing love were probably messier, more contradictory, more repetitive, and more obviously influenced by the participants' personal experiences and desires rather than abstract philosophical principles. Politics was another common topic, and potentially a dangerous one. Athens had complex political dynamics, faction-based conflicts, and serious consequences for being on the wrong side of political disputes. Discussing politics while drunk could lead to revealing your actual allegiances and opinions rather than the publicly acceptable positions you maintained while sober. This created risk. If the wrong people learned about your real political views, it could damage your career or even threaten your safety. The symposium's promise of confidentiality was supposed to protect against this, but as we've discussed, that confidentiality was never absolute and depended on everyone present keeping quiet about what they heard. The drinking games that sometimes happened at symposia could incorporate philosophical or intellectual elements. Kottabos, the wine-flinging game, could be combined with challenges to recite poetry or answer riddles. Someone might have to improvise a verse in a specific meter or solve a logical puzzle or provide a clever response to a philosophical question, with failure resulting in having to drink more. These games made intellect performative and competitive in playful ways that complemented the more serious debates happening at other points in the evening. The performative aspect of symposium philosophy meant that style mattered as much as substance, possibly more. How you presented your argument, your voice, your gestures, your rhetorical flourishes, your timing, all of this affected how your ideas were received. Someone making a mediocre point with excellent delivery might be more successful than someone making a brilliant point with poor presentation. This wasn't unique to symposia. Greek culture generally valued rhetoric and performance, but the combination of competitive dynamics and progressive intoxication probably amplified the importance of style over substance. There's evidence that some of the philosophical schools and ideas that developed in ancient Greece had connections to symposium culture. The Cynics, for example, were known for provocative behaviour and challenging conventional values in ways that might have originated in or been reinforced by symposium debates, where defending unconventional positions was valued. The Sophists made careers out of teaching the kinds of argumentative skills that would serve you well at symposia. The entire tradition of dialectical philosophy, advancing knowledge through structured debate between opposing positions, has roots in the kind of competitive discussion that happened at drinking parties. The paradox mentioned in the reference material is worth emphasizing. Sometimes genuine philosophical insights did emerge from this chaos of competitive drunk debating. The conditions weren't ideal for careful reasoned inquiry. People were intoxicated, emotionally engaged, more interested in winning than truth-finding, but occasionally the spark would catch anyway. Someone would make a connection they wouldn't have made sober. Someone would challenge an assumption everyone had accepted without thinking. Someone would ask a question that opened up new lines of inquiry. These moments were probably rare, and recognizing them required that someone present was sober enough, or would remember clearly enough to capture the insight before it disappeared into the general haze of the evening. The morning-after process of reconstructing what had been discussed and whether anything valuable had emerged must have been interesting. People would compare their fragmentary memories, trying to piece together arguments and insights. The person who'd stayed most sober would be consulted as the authority on what had actually been said. Notes might be made. Some ancient texts originated as post-symposium reconstructions of discussions, though how accurate these were is questionable. The brilliant insights that had seemed so clear while drunk might dissolve under sober examination, revealed as mundane or confused or simply wrong. But occasionally something would survive the transition from drunk intuition to sober analysis, and would be worth developing further. This filtering process, drunk generation of ideas followed by sober evaluation and refinement, might actually have been productive in ways the Greeks didn't fully understand. The wine lowered inhibitions and allowed for freer thinking that could generate novel ideas, even if most of them were garbage. The sober analysis the next day would separate the viable insights from the dross. This two-stage process used intoxication and sobriety for their respective strengths, creativity and evaluation, in a way that neither state alone might have achieved. Whether the Greeks consciously recognized this or just stumbled into it through cultural practice is unclear. The preservation of symposium philosophy in written form creates selection bias that we need to account for. The discussions that got written down and survived to the present were the ones that seemed worth recording and preserving, which were probably not representative of typical symposium conversations. Most symposia likely featured forgettable discussions that nobody thought to document. The ones that made it into literature were exceptional in quality, or at least in having participants who were famous enough that their conversation seemed worth recording. So when we read Plato's Symposium or Xenophon's Symposium, we're seeing the best-case scenario, not the average evening of drunk men arguing about philosophy. The competitive dynamics meant that symposium philosophy could be brutal in ways that wouldn't be acceptable in other contexts. You could aggressively attack someone's argument, point out their logical errors, mock their reasoning, and this would be considered fair play as long as it was about the arguments rather than personal attacks. Though the line between attacking someone's ideas and attacking the person probably got blurry, especially as people got drunker and more emotional. Someone whose philosophical position had been demolished might take it personally, might get angry, might hold grudges. The symposium was supposed to be a space where you could fight intellectually without permanent damage to relationships, but this ideal didn't always match reality. Women's exclusion from these philosophical discussions had lasting effects on Greek philosophy that we're still dealing with. The questions that got asked, the perspectives that got considered, the examples that got used, the priorities that shaped inquiry, all of these were determined by groups of drunk men talking to each other without female input. This doesn't mean Greek philosophy was worthless, but it does mean it had blind spots and limitations that reflected its origins in male-only drinking parties. Modern philosophy still carries some of this DNA, still sometimes operates on assumptions that were forged in symposia where half the human population wasn't allowed to participate. The symposium as a site of philosophical production is weird when you think about it seriously. These weren't monasteries where scholars devoted themselves to contemplation. They weren't academies with formal structures and curricula. They were drinking parties. The fact that drinking parties produced philosophical insights that shaped Western thought for millennia is either a testament to the Greeks' exceptional brilliance or an indication that formal academic structures might not be as necessary for philosophical progress as we sometimes assume. Probably both. The element of play in symposium philosophy shouldn't be underestimated. These men were playing with ideas the way they might play with a ball, tossing them around, seeing what they could do with them, enjoying the activity for its own sake rather than for any practical outcome. This playfulness might have been essential to the creative aspects of Greek philosophy. When you're playing, you're willing to try things that seem risky or unconventional. You're less worried about being wrong because the stakes feel lower. This is exactly the mindset that can generate innovative thinking, and the symposium's combination of wine, competition, and social bonding created conditions where play was possible for adults in ways it wouldn't be in more formal settings. The theatrical aspect was always present. You were performing for an audience of your peers, and your performance would be evaluated and remembered. This created pressure to be impressive, to demonstrate your education and wit, to show you belonged in this company of educated men. Some people thrived under this pressure. It brought out their best thinking and speaking. Others choked. The performance anxiety made them less effective than they might have been in lower stakes contexts. The symposium sorted people into successful performers and unsuccessful ones in ways that probably correlated imperfectly with their actual philosophical abilities. The use of wine as intellectual performance-enhancing drug has modern parallels in various substances people use to affect their cognitive state while working or creating. The principle is the same. Alter your brain chemistry to access different kinds of thinking than you'd have access to in your normal state. The Greeks used wine. Others have used coffee, nicotine, amphetamines, psychedelics, or various other substances. The underlying belief is that sometimes the sober, normal mind isn't optimal for certain kinds of intellectual work, and that chemical intervention can help. Whether this actually works or just makes people think they're doing better work than they actually are is debatable, and probably varies by person and substance and task. The fact that symposium debates often descended into volume contests rather than reasoned discussion is darkly amusing but also recognizable from modern contexts. When people have strongly held positions and their ability to argue coherently has been compromised, whether by alcohol or emotion or just intellectual exhaustion, they often resort to simply asserting their views more loudly. Volume becomes a substitute for logic. Repetition replaces reasoning. This happens in modern political debates, family arguments, and yes, still in drinking discussions. The Greeks didn't invent this dynamic, but they gave it a formal setting and apparently didn't find it embarrassing enough to stop doing it. The morning after embarrassment of realizing you'd argued passionately for positions you didn't actually believe or couldn't defend, when sober must have been a regular feature of symposium culture. You'd wake up, piece together what you'd said based on fragments of memory and others' accounts, and realize you'd made a fool of yourself defending an absurd claim just to show you could argue effectively. Whether you laughed this off or felt genuinely embarrassed probably depended on your personality and how badly the performance had gone. Greek culture valued the ability to take mockery and not let it bother you. They had concepts of shame, but also valued being thick-skinned enough to handle social embarrassment. The relationship between wine and wisdom in Greek thought was complex. Wine was associated with Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and theatre, all things involving altered states and the crossing of boundaries. There was a sense that wine could provide access to truths or experiences that sober rationality couldn't reach. But there was also awareness that wine could make you stupid, cause you to do and say things you'd regret, and generally be destructive if not properly managed. The symposium tried to harness wine's positive potential, while containing its destructive tendencies through ritual and social control, with varying degrees of success. Looking back at symposium philosophy from our contemporary position reveals how much of what we consider serious intellectual work was produced in contexts that seem frivolous or inappropriate by modern academic standards. We've professionalized philosophy, created departments and journals and conferences with formal procedures. We've separated serious intellectual work from entertainment and socializing in ways the Greeks didn't. Whether this professionalization has made philosophy better or just different is debatable. We've probably gained in rigor and systematic development of ideas. We've probably lost some of the creativity and boundary crossing that happened when philosophy was still mixed up with drinking and socializing and competition. The symposium as theatre of mock learning, where people performed knowledge they half had while pretending to care about truth, while actually caring more about looking impressive, was simultaneously a space where genuine learning and insight could happen. The contradiction is the point. Humans are complicated. We can be sincere and performative simultaneously. We can seek truth while seeking status. We can learn while playing. The Greeks built an institution that accommodated all of these contradictory human tendencies at once, and somehow made it productive enough that we're still reading and discussing what came out of it 2,500 years later. Whether this happened because of the drinking or despite it, or through some complex interaction between wine and competition and homosocial bonding that we don't fully understand, is probably impossible to determine at this point. But it definitely happened, and that's weird and interesting enough to be worth thinking about, preferably while sober. The morning after a symposium was when reality sent its bill for the previous evening's suspension of normal rules. And unlike modern credit cards where you can at least delay payment, this bill came due immediately upon waking, delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the skull. The Greeks didn't have aspirin. They didn't have electrolyte drinks or greasy breakfast foods or any of the hangover mitigation strategies that modern drinkers take for granted. What they had was full awareness that they'd spent the previous evening consuming significant quantities of wine, and that there would be consequences for this decision, consequences that were now arriving with the morning sun. The physical symptoms of an ancient Greek hangover were probably identical to modern hangovers, because human biology hasn't changed significantly in 2,500 years. Headache, definitely. The ancient Greeks would have experienced the same pounding skull that comes from dehydration and the toxic effects of alcohol metabolism. Nausea, almost certainly. The stomach doesn't appreciate being filled with wine for hours, even diluted wine, and it makes its displeasure known the next morning. Sensitivity to light and sound, absolutely. The symptoms that make you want to stay in a dark, quiet room rather than face the world. Fatigue despite having slept. Dry mouth. General bodily discomfort. All the greatest hits of alcohol's revenge on the human body. But the Greeks had to deal with these symptoms without modern medicine, or even a modern understanding of what was happening to them. They didn't know about dehydration or blood alcohol levels or liver function. They just knew that drinking too much wine made you feel terrible the next day, and their explanatory framework for this involved the gods, imbalanced humours, and miasma rather than biochemistry. Not that understanding the biochemistry would have made the headache hurt less, but at least modern hangovers come with the knowledge that you're experiencing a well-understood physiological process rather than possible divine punishment for your excesses. The physical hangover was genuinely just the beginning, though. It was the obvious, immediate consequence that you'd start experiencing as soon as you woke up. The real problems, the ones that would last longer and potentially cause more damage, were psychological and social. Because while your head would stop pounding eventually and your stomach would settle and you'd rehydrate, the things you'd said while drunk would remain said. The arguments you'd had couldn't be unhad. The embarrassing moments you'd experienced had been witnessed by however many people were present at the symposium, and those witnesses would remember even if you didn't. This is where the fragmentary nature of drunk memory became a serious problem. Your recollection of the evening would be incomplete and possibly inaccurate. You might remember the early part clearly when you were still relatively sober, but the later hours would be increasingly hazy. You might have vivid memories of certain moments, but no clear sense of how they connected or what order they happened in. You might have complete gaps where you had no memory at all of what you'd said or done. This uncertainty was deeply uncomfortable because you couldn't assess how much damage control you needed to do without knowing what had actually happened. So the morning after would involve a kind of intelligence gathering operation where you'd try to piece together an accurate picture of the previous evening's events. If you lived with family, you might ask them what time you'd arrived home and in what condition, which would give you some data points. If servants had accompanied you to or from the symposium, they might be able to fill in some gaps, though they might also choose to be diplomatically vague about details that would embarrass you. If you encountered other symposium participants during the day, you'd try to gauge from their reactions whether you'd done anything particularly problematic in their presence. These encounters with other participants would be delicate social dances. Neither person wanted to admit they didn't fully remember the evening, because that would reveal how drunk they'd gotten. But both people needed information about what had happened. So you'd have these carefully calibrated conversations where everyone was simultaneously trying to gather intelligence and avoid revealing how much they didn't know. Someone might say something like, "That was quite an evening," in a tone that could mean anything from "we had fun" to "you completely embarrassed yourself," depending on how you interpreted it. And you'd have to respond in ways that acknowledged the statement without committing to any specific interpretation until you'd figured out what actually happened. The person who'd stayed most sober would be a crucial source of information, but consulting them came with costs. They'd remember everything, which was useful, but they'd also know you didn't remember everything, which gave them power over you. They could choose to be kind and fill you in on what you needed to know without judgment. They could be merciful and downplay your worst moments. They could be manipulative and use their knowledge as leverage for future favours. Or they could be cruel and make sure everyone knew about your embarrassing behaviour. Your relationship with this person and your respective social positions would determine which of these options they'd choose. The servants who'd been present at the symposium also knew everything, and faced their own calculations about what to share with whom. A servant might be loyal to their master and protect him by minimizing reports of his misbehaviour. They might be pragmatic and trade information for better treatment or small rewards. They might be resentful and take pleasure in revealing their master's foolishness to others. The morning after a symposium was when the power dynamics between servants and masters could shift subtly, as everyone figured out who knew what and what they might do with that knowledge. For the host of the symposium, the morning after brought its own special challenges. Physical hangover, plus the aftermath of whatever social dynamics had unfolded, plus the practical problem of cleaning up the andron and dealing with any damage that had occurred. Wine stains on expensive fabrics, broken cups or furniture, spills on the floor mosaics. All of this needed to be addressed. The host would also need to assess whether the event had been successful socially. Had people enjoyed themselves? Had anyone been seriously offended? Would people want to return his invitation in the future, or would they find excuses to avoid hosting him after this experience? The economic cost of hosting also became more apparent in the morning. In the enthusiasm of the evening, serving the best wine and plenty of it seemed like the right choice. In the harsh light of day, calculating how much had been spent on wine that mostly ended up creating hangovers rather than lasting positive impressions, might feel less worthwhile. The host had invested significant resources in food, wine, lighting, servants' time, and the opportunity cost of spending an evening drinking rather than doing something productive. Whether this investment had paid off in terms of social bonds, alliances, or reputation enhancement wouldn't be fully clear for days or weeks as the consequences of the evening played out. The Greeks didn't have much in the way of hangover remedies that we'd recognise as effective. They might try various herbal preparations or special foods, but these were based on theories about balancing humours and wouldn't have addressed the actual physiological causes of hangover symptoms. Mostly they just had to tough it out, which meant functioning through the day while feeling terrible and hoping nobody important needed them to be at their best. If you had political responsibilities or business meetings or legal proceedings to attend, you'd have to do so while hungover, which put you at a disadvantage compared to anyone who'd spent the previous evening sober. This created interesting situations where hangover management became a competitive skill. Men who attended symposia regularly would develop strategies for minimizing their next-day impairment. Some might have better natural tolerance or recovery. Others might have figured out techniques for pacing their drinking, or choosing when to participate actively versus when to ease back. The most skilled symposium goers could drink enough to participate credibly in the collective experience, but not so much that they'd be useless the next day. This was genuinely difficult to calibrate, especially when social pressure pushed toward drinking more and competitive dynamics made moderation seem like weakness. The walk through Athens the morning after a symposium, heading to wherever you needed to be, would be its own kind of ordeal. You'd be hungover, possibly still slightly drunk if the symposium had gone very late and you hadn't had much time to sleep it off. You'd be hoping not to encounter anyone who'd been at the symposium or who'd heard about your behaviour there. You'd be trying to present yourself as a respectable citizen while feeling like death warmed over. The gap between the image you needed to project and the reality of your physical and mental state would require constant performance, and maintaining that performance while hungover takes effort that you really don't have available. The servants and slaves going about their morning work would see these hungover men trying to maintain dignity while clearly suffering, and they'd have their own opinions about the whole situation. From their perspective, wealthy men had spent the evening getting drunk and philosophical while they worked, and now those same men were paying the price for their indulgence, while the servants continued working through their own fatigue from the long evening of service. Whether servants found this amusing or frustrating or just part of the expected order of things would vary, but they certainly noticed the disconnect between the self-image of these educated elite men and their actual hungover stumbling through. Morning responsibilities. The fragmentary memories weren't just embarrassing, they were genuinely anxiety-producing. You might have a sudden flash of memory from the evening that seemed alarming. Did you really say that thing about someone's wife? Did you actually argue that justice was a social construction invented by the weak to constrain the strong? Did you tell that story about your business partner that you'd promised to keep confidential? These memory fragments would surface randomly throughout the day, each one bringing a fresh wave of concern about whether you damaged important relationships or revealed things that should have stayed private. The problem was that you couldn't trust these memory fragments to be accurate. Drunk memory is notoriously unreliable. You might remember things that didn't happen, or remember them in ways that were distorted from reality. So you'd be anxious about something you thought you'd said, but you wouldn't even know for certain that you'd actually said it, which meant you couldn't properly apologize or do damage control because you didn't know if there was actually damage to control. This uncertainty was psychologically exhausting and would persist until you could gather enough information from reliable sources to know what had really happened. Some mornings after would involve discovering that you'd made commitments while drunk that you now had to honor while sober. You might have promised to support someone's political campaign, or lend money, or introduce someone to a valuable contact, or any number of other obligations that seemed reasonable while intoxicated, but problematic in the cold light of day. Greek society took promises seriously, so you couldn't just dismiss these commitments as drunk talk that didn't count. If witnesses remembered you making the promise, you'd be expected to follow through, even if you didn't remember making it or regretted it now that you were sober. The possibility of having insulted someone while drunk was particularly concerning because Athens had a complex honor culture where insults could lead to legal or social consequences. If you'd said something genuinely offensive about another citizen, especially in front of witnesses, that person might demand satisfaction in various forms. They might want a public apology, They might spread damaging rumours about you in retaliation. In extreme cases, they might even bring legal action if the insult was serious enough. So the morning after included calculating these risks and trying to assess whether you needed to do preemptive damage control before the person you'd insulted decided how to respond. The friends you'd made during the symposium might seem less like friends in the morning. The bonding that happened over wine, the shared vulnerability, the deep conversations, the mutual promises of loyalty and support, all of that could feel embarrassingly overwrought when you thought about it sober. You might have told someone you barely knew your deepest insecurities, or made plans to collaborate on projects you had no real interest in, or expressed affection that you didn't actually feel outside the wine-soaked bubble of the symposium. Extricating yourself from these drunk alliances without offending people required social delicacy that was hard to manage while hangover impaired. The economic class of participants would affect their morning after experience in various ways. Wealthy men might not have pressing responsibilities that required them to function effectively the day after a symposium. They could take it easy, stay home, let servants handle things. Less wealthy men who attended symposia at the margins of their financial capacity might have to work through their hangovers because they couldn't afford a day of reduced productivity. This created another advantage for wealth beyond just being able to attend symposia in the first place. You could also better afford the recovery time afterward. The servants cleaning up the andron the morning after would find evidence of the evening's events that might not match the participants' memories or the official story about what happened. Broken items, stains, the sheer volume of wine that had been consumed, all of this told a story about how wild the evening had actually gotten. Smart servants would clean up quietly and not comment on what they found, but they'd know, and that knowledge added to the general pool of information about what really happened versus what people would claim happened. For men with families, returning home in the early morning hours drunk or hungover created its own complications. Wives would have opinions about husbands who'd spent the evening drinking and philosophizing, rather than attending to family responsibilities. They might express these opinions directly or through pointed silence. They might be concerned about the expense of attending symposia or worried about reputational damage if the husband had behaved badly. The husband would have to navigate these domestic consequences while dealing with physical hangover symptoms and uncertainty about what had actually happened the previous evening. The cycle of symposium attendance meant that the hangover you were experiencing wouldn't be the last one you'd ever have. You knew, even while suffering through this particular morning after, that you'd likely attend another symposium soon and go through this same process again. The rational response would be to moderate your drinking at future events to avoid repeating this experience. But the social pressures and competitive dynamics and the nature of symposia made moderation difficult, so you'd probably end up drinking too much again and waking up to another hangover despite your current suffering. The Greeks were aware of this cycle but seemed to accept it as the price of participating in their culture's primary social and intellectual institution. The philosophical discussions from the previous evening might seem less profound in the morning. Arguments that had seemed brilliant and insights that had felt revolutionary while drunk would often deflate under sober examination. You'd realize that the amazing point you'd made about the nature of virtue was actually just a confused restatement of something Socrates had said better decades ago, or that the clever argument you'd constructed to defend an absurd position didn't actually hold up to basic logical scrutiny, or that the deep emotional truth you'd expressed had been embarrassingly maudlin. This deflation was humbling but also necessary for separating the genuinely valuable ideas from the drunk nonsense. Occasionally, though, something valuable would survive the transition from drunk insight to sober evaluation. An idea that had seemed interesting while drinking would still seem interesting in the morning, and you'd realize it was worth developing further. This was the symposium justifying itself, showing that despite all the hangovers and embarrassment and social complications, genuine intellectual progress could happen in these settings. Whether this justified the cost is debatable, but it was enough to keep the institution going and to make participants willing to suffer through another hangover for the chance of another breakthrough. The reputation management that happened in the days after a symposium was crucial for maintaining your social position. If you'd said or done something embarrassing, you needed to acknowledge it appropriately. Not so much that you seemed weak or overly concerned about others' opinions, but enough that you demonstrated awareness and good humour about your behaviour. Greek culture valued the ability to laugh at yourself and not take mockery too seriously. If you'd made a fool of yourself while drunk and then got defensive and embarrassed about it the next day, that would make things worse. If you acknowledged it with good humour and moved on, people would respect that and the incident would be forgotten more quickly. The selective memory that happened in the days after a symposium, where people collectively decided which events to remember and which to forget, was fascinating social negotiation. Certain incidents would be preserved and would become stories that got told about the participants. Others would be quietly dropped from the collective narrative, allowed to fade away rather than being repeatedly mentioned. This selective preservation was influenced by power dynamics. More powerful participants had more influence over which stories survived, but also by group consensus about what was funny versus what was too embarrassing or offensive to keep bringing up. The morning after also brought assessment of physical damage beyond just hangover symptoms. If the symposium had involved any physical activity, games, dancing, or, gods forbid, actual fighting, there might be bruises, scrapes, or worse to deal with. Ancient Greek medicine was limited, so treating injuries mostly involved time and hope rather than effective interventions. You'd have to explain any visible injuries to people who asked, and your explanation would need to balance honesty with maintaining dignity. I fell off a couch while trying to demonstrate proper kotobos technique is honest but not particularly dignified. The host's relationship with guests would be tested in the aftermath. If he'd served wine that was too strong or encouraged excessive drinking, or allowed the evening to get out of control in ways that led to serious problems, guests might blame him and be reluctant to attend future events. If he'd been a good host who'd managed the evening well despite the chaos that alcohol naturally creates, guests would remember that positively and be more likely to reciprocate with invitations. The morning after was when these judgments started to form, as people reflected on their experience and decided whether it had been worth the hangover. The servants who'd worked the symposium would have their own recovery to deal with. They'd been working all evening while everyone else drank, and they'd probably gotten less sleep than the guests because they had to clean up afterward. But they'd have to be back at work the next day with no allowance for fatigue, while their masters could rest and recover. This inequality was built into the system and nobody questioned it, but it meant that the actual costs of symposia were distributed very unevenly across the people involved. The potential for blackmail or social leverage based on drunk behaviour was very real, and the morning after was when people would start to assess whether they were vulnerable to this. If someone had witnessed you doing something genuinely compromising, revealing secrets, expressing opinions that could be politically dangerous, engaging in behaviour that would damage your reputation if it became widely known, they now had leverage over you. Whether they'd use it depended on various factors, but the mere possibility would create anxiety and might influence how you interacted with them going forward. The Greeks didn't romanticize hangovers the way some drinking cultures do. They didn't treat them as badges of honor or signs that you'd had a good time. Hangovers were understood as negative consequences of excessive drinking, unpleasant but unavoidable if you participated fully in symposia. This clear-eyed assessment didn't stop people from continuing to drink at symposia, but it meant they knew what they were signing up for. The hangover was the tax you paid for the temporary suspension of social norms, and while you might complain about paying it, you understood it was part of the deal. The morning after encounters between symposium participants in public spaces, the agora, the gymnasium, religious sites, would be charged with unspoken questions. Both people would be wondering what the other remembered, what they thought about the previous evening, whether any damage had been done to the relationship. Greek social codes provided scripts for these encounters that allowed people to acknowledge having attended the same event, without necessarily discussing details unless both parties wanted to. You could greet each other cordially, make vague positive remarks about the evening, and move on without committing to any specific account of what had happened. The longer-term consequences of symposium behaviour would play out over weeks and months as reputations were adjusted based on accumulated evidence of how people behaved while drunk. Someone who consistently made a fool of themselves would develop a reputation as someone who couldn't handle their wine, which would damage their social standing. Someone who always stayed witty and charming even while drinking heavily would gain respect. Someone who used symposia strategically to gather information or build alliances would be recognised as politically savvy. These reputations were built one symposium at a time, one morning after at a time, as people's patterns of behaviour became clear. The medical understanding of hangovers in ancient Greece was entirely wrong, but led to some treatments that might have had placebo effects if nothing else. Drinking specific herbal mixtures, eating particular foods, bathing in certain ways, none of this would have actually addressed the dehydration and toxic metabolites causing the hangover, but the act of doing something might have made people feel slightly better through placebo effect and the psychological comfort of having a treatment protocol. Modern hangover sufferers often do the same thing with folk remedies that don't actually work but make them feel like they're taking action. The paradox of the whole situation was that despite the hangovers, despite the embarrassment, despite the social complications and the economic costs and all the other negative consequences, men would continue attending symposia. They'd wake up hungover, swear they'd never do this again, and then accept the next invitation that came. The symposium met needs that were important enough to outweigh the costs. Needs for social connection, intellectual stimulation, status maintenance, emotional expression, and just plain fun. The hangover was the price of admission, and enough people thought it was worth paying that the institution survived for centuries. Looking at ancient Greek hangovers from our modern perspective reveals that while we have better treatments and better understanding of what's happening, the basic human experience hasn't changed. The physical suffering, the social anxiety, the fragmented memories, the damage control, the mixture of regret and willingness to do it again, all of this is recognizable to anyone who's ever overdone it at social gathering. The Greeks just formalized and ritualized the process in ways that made it culturally significant rather than just personally embarrassing. They turned the morning after into part of the symposium experience, incorporated it into their social system, and made it work as one more element of their complex approach to balancing civilization and chaos. Whether this made their hangovers better or worse than ours is impossible to say, but it definitely made them more interesting to think about 2,500 years later, which is worth something. So here we are at the end of our journey through the ancient Greek symposium, and if you're still awake, congratulations. You've just spent the last few hours learning about an institution that somehow managed to be simultaneously a drinking party, a philosophical salon, an exclusive social club, and the birthplace of ideas that still shape how we think about everything from love to justice to the nature of reality itself. Which is genuinely bizarre when you step back and think about it. Western civilization's intellectual foundations were laid in rooms full of drunk men lying on couches arguing about whether virtue could be taught, while musicians who weren't allowed to speak watched the whole thing unfold. Not exactly the origin story you'd expect for the philosophical tradition that dominates universities worldwide, but here we are. The symposium wasn't some quaint cultural curiosity that the Greeks did on the side while the real work of civilization building happened elsewhere. It was central to how Greek culture functioned and how Greek ideas developed. This matters because we're still living with the consequences of what happened in those wine-soaked rooms 2,500 years ago. The questions the Greeks asked, the ways they approached philosophical inquiry, the assumptions they made about knowledge and virtue and the good life, all of this was shaped by the specific social context of the symposium. And that context was men drinking together in a highly ritualized setting that simultaneously enforced and dissolved social hierarchies while excluding half the population and treating the other half as either decoration or invisible labor. The fact that this weird, contradictory, deeply flawed institution produced philosophy that we still take seriously is either a testament to human beings' ability to create something valuable under almost any conditions, or evidence that we haven't actually progressed as much as we like to think we have in terms of how we do intellectual work. Probably both. The symposium proved that you don't need perfect conditions to have breakthrough insights. You don't need formal academic structures or rigorous peer review or professional philosophers working in isolation. What you apparently need is wine, competitive men with too much education and too much time, a space where normal rules are temporarily suspended, and enough structure to prevent complete chaos while allowing for substantial disorder. The controlled chaos aspect is worth emphasizing because it's key to understanding why the symposium worked as well as it did. Too much order, and you don't get the creative freedom and intellectual risk-taking that produces original ideas. Too much chaos, and you just get drunk people saying random things that don't amount to anything coherent. The symposium walked this line between structure and disorder, using ritual and rules to contain the chaos that wine and competition and male egos naturally created. This balance was delicate and probably failed as often as it succeeded, but when it worked, it created conditions where genuine intellectual innovation could happen. The wine was essential to this balance. It lowered inhibitions enough that people would say things they'd normally keep to themselves, propose ideas they'd usually dismiss as too speculative or risky, challenge authorities and conventional wisdom in ways they'd avoid while sober. But the wine also destroyed coherence and logical reasoning, which meant that any insights generated while drunk had to be captured and evaluated later by sober minds. The symposium wasn't just the drunk conversation. It was the drunk conversation plus the morning after reconstruction, plus the subsequent sober development of whatever ideas survived that filtering process. It was a two-stage system that used intoxication and sobriety for their respective strengths. The horizontal positioning that forced everyone onto couches did something similar with social hierarchy. Greek society was rigidly stratified, with clear distinctions between citizens and non-citizens, wealthy and poor, educated and uneducated. These hierarchies shaped every interaction in normal contexts. The symposium couldn't eliminate them, they were too fundamental to the social structure, but it could temporarily obscure them enough that freer exchange was possible. Making everyone lie down created a kind of temporary equality that existed alongside persistent inequality, and this contradiction was productive rather than paralyzing. Men could speak more freely because they were symbolically equal even while they remained actually unequal. The exclusion of respectable women was structural to how the symposium functioned, and we can't talk about the institution's legacy without acknowledging this. The philosophy that emerged from symposia was developed entirely by men, for men, in contexts where women couldn't participate or contribute. This shaped what questions got asked, what perspectives got considered, what counted as important or interesting. Greek philosophy has blind spots and limitations that directly result from its origins in male-only drinking parties, and those blind spots persisted into later philosophical traditions that built on Greek foundations. We're still working through the implications of this, still trying to correct for the biases that got built in when half of humanity wasn't allowed in the room where the thinking happened. But the women who were present, the servants, the musicians, the heterai, complicate this picture in interesting ways. They were there, they watched and listened, they formed their own understandings of what they witnessed. Their perspectives just weren't recorded or valued, which means we've lost access to alternative interpretations of symposium philosophy that might have been quite different from what the drunk men thought was happening. The symposium's legacy includes not just what was preserved, but also what was lost when certain voices weren't considered worth documenting. The competitive element of symposia, the way philosophical discussion became intellectual sport, shaped how Greek philosophy developed in lasting ways. Ideas weren't just evaluated on their truth or utility, but on how well they could be defended in debate, how impressive they sounded when articulated, how effectively they positioned the speaker relative to rivals. This created pressure toward clever argumentation and rhetorical sophistication, which had benefits. It encouraged clear thinking and logical rigor, but also costs. It sometimes prioritized winning over truth-seeking. Modern academic philosophy still shows traces of this competitive dynamic, still sometimes values clever arguments over simple truths, still rewards people who can defend positions brilliantly, regardless of whether those positions are actually correct. The symposium proved that informal social spaces could be sites of serious intellectual work. You didn't need monasteries or universities or research institutes to make progress on fundamental questions about reality and human life. You just needed people who cared about these questions, a space where they could discuss them freely, and conditions that encouraged both honesty and creativity. This insight has been rediscovered repeatedly throughout history by groups who found that some of their best thinking happens in informal settings: cafes, bars, dinner parties, late-night dorm room conversations. The symposium gave institutional form to something that humans seem to do naturally when we have leisure time, education, and wine. The legacy of the symposium extends beyond just philosophy into how we think about social space and intellectual community. The idea that you need a room that's separate from normal life, where different rules apply, where people can speak freely without the usual consequences, this idea shows up everywhere. Academic conferences with their evening receptions, writers' retreats, corporate offsites, artist residencies, even modern dinner parties where conversation is valued. All of these draw on a tradition that the Greeks formalized in the symposium. We keep recreating versions of the symposium because we keep recognizing the value of bringing people together in contexts that are structured enough to be productive, but loose enough to be creative. The morning after dynamic, where insights generated while intoxicated or emotionally engaged have to be evaluated by more sober and rational minds, is also a pattern we see repeated. It's not just about alcohol. Any time you have a brainstorming session or creative workshop or energetic discussion, that generates lots of ideas, you need a subsequent filtering process to separate the good ideas from the garbage. The symposium institutionalized this two-stage process, recognizing implicitly that generation and evaluation of ideas require different mental states and social conditions. We're still using this basic pattern in how we organize creative and intellectual work. The economic model of the symposium, where hosting required significant resources but also brought social returns through alliance building and reputation enhancement, created a system where wealth was converted into cultural capital through the medium of wine and conversation. This isn't fundamentally different from how modern elites use dinner parties, charity galas, and other social events to maintain networks and demonstrate status. The specific form has changed. We don't lie on couches and mix wine with water, but the underlying dynamics of using hospitality to build social bonds and display cultural sophistication remain remarkably similar. The power of being the person who stays sober while others get drunk, who remembers while others forget, who observes while others perform. This power dynamic continues to exist in any social setting, where some people are more impaired than others. The symposium made this visible and gave it a role in the social ecosystem. Modern contexts where this happens tend to downplay or ignore the power asymmetries involved, but they're still there. The sober person at a party still has informational and tactical advantages over drunk people, still has the choice about what to do with that advantage, still occupies a position that's both privileged and isolated. The musicians and servants who were present but not participants, who worked while others played, who remained invisible despite being essential, this pattern also persists in modern contexts. Every conference has support staff who handle logistics. Every party has someone doing the work of hosting. Every intellectual gathering depends on invisible labor that makes the visible activity possible. The symposium was honest about this in ways we often aren't. The servants and musicians were explicitly recognized as being there to serve, their labor acknowledged even if it wasn't properly valued. We tend to make this labor even more invisible, pretending that events happen through magic rather than through the work of people we're choosing not to notice. The philosophical content that came out of symposia has had influence that's hard to overstate. Plato's dialogues, many of which are set at or reference symposia, shaped Western philosophy for centuries and still structure how we approach questions about knowledge, justice, love, and the good life. Xenophon's accounts of symposium conversations provide alternative perspectives that complicate and enrich our understanding of Greek thought. The fragmentary evidence we have from other symposium-related texts suggests that this was a rich intellectual tradition, with more diversity than what survived to the present. We're working with the remnants of a much larger body of thought that was generated in these drunken gatherings, but we need to be cautious about taking the literary symposia as accurate representations of what actually happened at these events. Plato wasn't transcribing real conversations, he was using the symposium setting as a literary frame for philosophical dialogues that were crafted for specific purposes. The real symposia were messier, less coherent, more influenced by wine and ego and social dynamics than the polished texts suggest. The symposia in literature are idealized versions that capture something true about the institution, while leaving out the chaos, repetition, incoherence, and embarrassment that characterized actual events. The symposium's influence on how we think about education and learning is also significant. The Greek model of paideia, the formation of cultured, virtuous citizens through broad education in literature, music, athletics, and philosophy, was partly realized through symposium participation. Young men learned how to perform their education, how to engage in philosophical discussion, how to navigate complex social dynamics, how to drink without losing dignity. This was practical education in how to be an elite Greek male, and it happened through participation in an institution that was simultaneously educational and recreational, serious and playful, formative and destructive. Modern education has moved away from this model in some ways. We have formal curricula, professional teachers, institutional structures, but we still recognize the value of informal learning that happens through social interaction. Study groups, seminar discussions, academic conferences, even just conversations with peers, all of these draw on the insight that learning happens through dialogue, and that some of the most valuable education occurs outside formal instructional contexts. The symposium was an early and influential example of this principle in action. The idea that you can be wrong without catastrophic consequences, that intellectual experimentation and failure are necessary for innovation, that spaces for trying out ideas without full commitment are valuable. These insights were embedded in symposium practice. When you're drunk and arguing about philosophy, everyone understands that you might be saying things you don't fully believe or defending positions you'll abandon tomorrow. This permission to explore ideas without permanent commitment creates freedom that's valuable for intellectual development. We try to recreate this in academic contexts through concepts like academic freedom and scholarly debate, though we're often less explicit about the permission to be wrong than the Greeks were. The symposium also demonstrated that progress can come from unlikely sources and through unconventional methods. If you'd asked someone to design an optimal system for advancing human knowledge, they probably wouldn't have come up with get educated men drunk and make them argue on couches. But it worked, at least well enough to produce philosophy that lasted millennia. This suggests we should be cautious about assuming we know the best ways to organize intellectual work and open to the possibility that valuable insights might emerge from contexts that seem frivolous or inappropriate by conventional standards. The tension between individual competition and collective collaboration that characterize symposia is still something we struggle with in intellectual and creative work. You want people to push each other, to challenge ideas, to compete for the best arguments. This drives quality. But you also want cooperation, building on each other's insights, working together towards shared understanding. This drives progress. The symposium managed both simultaneously by making the competition happen within a collaborative framework. Men competed with each other while also collectively participating in a shared project of philosophical inquiry. We're still trying to find the right balance between these competing imperatives. The role of alcohol specifically in symposia raises interesting questions about the relationship between altered states and creativity or insight. The Greeks believed wine could provide access to truths that sober rationality couldn't reach, and while we know more about how alcohol actually affects the brain, the basic question remains valid. Do altered states, whether induced by alcohol or other means, actually facilitate different kinds of thinking? Modern research suggests they might, that reduced inhibition and altered neural connectivity can sometimes lead to creative insights. But the Greeks also knew that these insights need sober evaluation, that what seems profound while drunk often isn't. The two-stage process of generation and evaluation remains relevant. The symposium's legacy and how we think about friendship and social bonding is also worth noting. The Greeks believed that true friendship required shared experiences, including shared vulnerability. The symposium provided context for this. You got drunk together, said things you wouldn't say sober, saw each other in less than dignified states, and this created bonds that went beyond superficial social connections. Modern culture still recognizes this pattern. We bond with people we've been through difficult or unusual experiences with. We form deeper connections when we're willing to be vulnerable with each other. The symposium ritualized and formalized these processes in ways that we've largely lost, but that point to something true about human social psychology. The question of whether the symposium was ultimately more good than bad is complicated and probably unanswerable. It produced philosophy that shaped civilization. It also reinforced gender hierarchies, excluded most people from participation, and normalized getting drunk as a prerequisite for intellectual discussion. It created spaces for male bonding and emotional expression. It also channeled that bonding and expression in ways that served elite interests and maintained existing power structures. It generated genuine insights about fundamental questions. It also wasted enormous amounts of time and resources on drunken arguments that went nowhere. Like most human institutions, it was a mix of valuable and problematic, brilliant and flawed, progressive and reactionary all at once. What we can say is that the symposium matters for understanding how Greek culture worked and how Western intellectual traditions developed. You can't understand Plato without understanding the symposium context he was writing from and about. You can't understand Greek approaches to philosophy without recognizing how much they were shaped by competitive debate in social settings. You can't understand the exclusions and blind spots in Western philosophy without seeing how they were built in from the beginning through the symposium's gender dynamics. The symposium is part of our intellectual DNA, and understanding it helps us understand ourselves. The modern equivalents of symposia, whether academic conferences, intellectual salons, dinner party conversations, or any other context where people gather to discuss ideas in social settings, inherit both the strengths and weaknesses of the Greek model. We still struggle with how to create spaces that are inclusive while maintaining intellectual rigor. We still deal with competitive dynamics that can enhance or undermine productive discussion. We still try to balance structure and freedom, seriousness and play, individual achievement and collective inquiry. The symposium doesn't give us answers to these challenges, but it shows us that humans have been wrestling with them for thousands of years and that there might not be perfect solutions, only ongoing negotiations between competing values. The fact that we're still talking about the symposium, still finding it interesting and relevant, still seeing our own social and intellectual practices reflected in this ancient institution, this itself is part of the legacy. The Greeks created something that resonated beyond their own time and culture, that captured something true about how humans think together and what conditions facilitate collective intellectual work. The specific forms have changed. We don't lie on couches or mix our wine with water or exclude women from philosophical discussions, at least not officially, but the underlying patterns persist. The symposium reminds us that human intellectual history isn't just a story of lone geniuses having breakthrough insights in isolation. It's also a story of social contexts, institutional structures, cultural practices, and yes, drinking parties that created conditions where innovation could happen. The great thinkers we remember and celebrate were embedded in social networks and cultural practices that shaped their thinking in ways they probably didn't fully recognize. Understanding these contexts doesn't diminish their achievements, but does complicate the simple narratives we sometimes tell about intellectual progress. The controlled chaos of the symposium, the careful balance between order and disorder, structure and freedom, sobriety and intoxication, offers a model that might be worth recovering in some ways, though obviously not in others. We've professionalized and formalized intellectual work in ways that have benefits but also costs. We've created rigorous standards and systematic methods, which is good. We've also sometimes made intellectual work boring, overly cautious, disconnected from the playfulness and experimentation that characterized Greek philosophy at its best. Finding ways to maintain rigor while recovering some of the creative energy of the symposium might be valuable. The legacy of the symposium lives on wherever people gather informally to discuss ideas, wherever social spaces become sites of intellectual exchange, wherever drinking and talking and arguing somehow produces insights that survive into sobriety. It lives on in graduate student bars where some of the best philosophical discussions happen after seminars end. It lives on in writers' groups where people workshop ideas over wine. It lives on in dinner conversations that turn unexpectedly deep. It lives on in any context where we recognize that some of our best thinking happens not in isolation or in formal settings, but in social spaces where we're relaxed enough to take risks and honest enough to challenge each other. The symposium proved that you can build civilization on drinking parties, or at least that drinking parties can contribute to civilization building in ways that are more significant than you'd expect. This doesn't mean we should structure all our intellectual institutions around alcohol consumption and competitive debate, but it does suggest that informal social practices can be vehicles for serious cultural work, that not everything valuable needs to be formalized and professionalized, that sometimes the best way to advance human knowledge is to gather people. Together, give them wine, create conditions for honest conversation, and see what emerges from the chaos. So that's the symposium, a weird, contradictory, fascinating institution that somehow managed to be simultaneously a drinking party and the birthplace of Western philosophy. It was deeply flawed in ways we can't ignore, but also genuinely innovative in ways we can learn from. It excluded people who should have been included, but also created spaces for thinking that weren't available elsewhere. It wasted enormous resources, but also produced ideas that shaped civilization. It was quintessentially Greek in its embrace of contradiction and its refusal to choose between competing values, instead finding ways to pursue them all simultaneously. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through the ancient Greek symposium. You've learned about the invitations and the wine and the couches and the women who were there and the women who weren't and the drinking games and the philosophy and the morning after hangovers. You've seen how an institution built around organized drinking managed to shape Western culture in ways that persist to the present. You've witnessed the Greeks at their best and their worst, their most brilliant and their most ridiculous, often simultaneously. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most important drinking parties. I hope you found it interesting, entertaining, and maybe even occasionally profound. Though if any profound insights emerged, remember the Greek lesson. They'll need sober evaluation in the morning to see if they're actually worth anything. So go ahead and close your eyes now. Let these stories of ancient Athens drift through your mind as you settle into sleep. Picture those androns with their couches and wine and conversations. Imagine the voices of men arguing about virtue and justice, while musicians played in the background. Feel the weight of all that history and all those ideas that started in such unlikely circumstances. And sleep well, knowing that even drinking parties can change the world if you do them right. Good night, everyone. Sweet dreams. And maybe next time you're at a party having a deep conversation over drinks, spare a thought for the ancient Greeks who turned that exact situation into one of the foundational institutions of Western civilization. They'd probably appreciate knowing their legacy lives on every time we drink together and argue about ideas, even if we're not doing it on couches with properly mixed wine while excluding half the population. Progress, after all, is about keeping what works and improving what doesn't. Sleep well,